The universe is not behaving like a place that wants to be fully known. On clear nights, when the sky feels calm enough to look harmless, we tilt our heads upward and believe we are seeing everything. A dome of stars, a black ocean scattered with light, the quiet confidence that what is visible must also be complete. It feels natural to assume that the universe ends somewhere far away, like land meeting the sea, and that one day, through better telescopes, better equations, better minds, we might finally reach that edge. But what if that feeling is the first illusion? What if the sensation of looking at everything is not a sign of completion, but a symptom of standing at the very edge of what is allowed to be seen? Imagine standing at night on a shoreline you cannot recognize as a shoreline. There are no waves, no sound of water, only darkness extending outward, stitched with faint points of light. You cannot tell whether you are looking across an ocean or into a vast empty field, or towards something that is quietly withdrawing from you as you stare. The absence of resistance makes you think there is nothing there. That is how the universe presents itself to us. We look outward and call it space. We look deeper and call it distance. We look far enough and call it the beginning. Yet every one of these words assumes that what lies before us is fully available to our sight, if only we could reach far enough. As if reality were waiting patiently, just beyond our current limits. But limits have a way of disguising themselves as horizons. From where you are sitting right now, the universe feels infinite. It feels open. It feels generous. The stars do not crowd each other. The dark between them feels endless, unclaimed. There is no wall in the sky, no sign that says stop here, nothing to warn you that you may already be standing at a boundary you cannot cross. And yet, physics whispers something colder. Light does not travel infinitely fast. It never has. Every photon that reaches your eyes tonight has spent years, centuries, sometimes billions of years, crossing space to get to you. You are not seeing stars as they are. You are seeing them as they were long before your species learned how to name them. This means something unsettling. There are regions of the universe whose light will never reach Earth. Not later, not with better technology, not with patience. Never. They exist. But they are permanently outside your future. Not hidden behind dust, not obscured by distance, but erased by time itself. There is a boundary around you right now, a sphere centered on your position in space and time, beyond which nothing can ever communicate with you. Not because it does not exist, but because the universe is expanding faster than information can travel. Space itself is pulling those regions away. Faster than light can close the gap. This boundary has a name, but the name does not matter. What matters is the implication. You are not inside the universe. Just as once, you are inside a portion of it, a visible fragment, a permitted slice, a region defined not by where reality ends, but by where communication fails. Everything beyond that boundary is not dark because it is empty. It is dark because it is unreachable. And this is where a quiet tension begins to form. Because once you accept that there are parts of reality that exist but can never affect you, a deeper question emerges. One that feels uncomfortable in its simplicity. If the universe we observe is limited, what are we actually standing on the edge of? We often imagine cosmic boundaries as walls, sharp endings where space abruptly stops. But the real boundaries are softer, more deceptive. They feel like open space. They invite curiosity. They do not announce themselves. They simply retreat at the same speed you advance. Every time we build a better telescope, we celebrate that the universe has grown larger. But has it? Or have we merely pushed our face closer to the glass? Because no matter how far we see, the horizon remains. Not fixed, not stable, but always present, always just out of reach. As if the universe itself is structured to allow observation without access. You can see it, you can measure it, you can model it, but you cannot go there. This is not how we talk about reality in everyday life. We are used to limits that can be broken, mountains climbed, oceans crossed, barriers overcome by time and effort. Our history is shaped by the belief that distance is a challenge, not a prohibition. The universe does not share that belief. There is no expedition that can travel beyond the observable boundary, no future civilization, no matter how advanced, that can step outside this region and report back. Not because we lack imagination, but because the structure of space-time itself forbids it. And this raises a thought that feels strangely personal. What if this boundary is not accidental? What if the observable universe is not everything so far, but everything allowed? At this point, something subtle happens in the mind. The sense of wonder begins to slip into something else, a faint unease. Not fear, just a quiet loss of certainty. Because the universe we thought we were exploring starts to feel less like an open wilderness and more like a carefully defined arena. And here is where I want to pause for a moment. If this idea that we may already be standing at the edge of what can ever be known has made you feel even slightly unsettled, if it has cracked open a question you didn't know you were carrying, then take a second to support this quiet space. This is Whispers of the Universe. If you're listening on YouTube, like this video, share it with someone who enjoys drifting through questions like this, and subscribe to stay inside this long, slow conversation. Those small signals are what allow this place to keep existing. Now let's continue, because the discomfort only deepens from here. If there is a boundary defined by light, by time, by expansion, then knowledge itself is trapped inside that boundary. Every equation we write, every theory we test, every story we tell about reality is shaped by a sample that is incomplete by design. We are not studying the universe. We are studying a window, and windows have frames. The unsettling part is not that something exists beyond the frame. The unsettling part is that our minds are built to ignore frames entirely. When you look out a window, you don't think about the glass. You think about the view. You assume the view continues, uninterrupted beyond what you can see. But in cosmology, the frame is not glass. It is law. The laws of physics themselves enforce this horizon. They do not allow information from beyond it to cross. They do not allow causal influence. They do not allow confirmation or denial. Anything beyond the observable universe is not merely unknown, it is fundamentally untestable. And yet, it still exists. This creates a strange category of reality. A realm that is real but unreachable, present but silent, there but forever irrelevant to our survival. Or so it seems. Because once you accept the existence of unreachable reality, another thought quietly forms, almost by accident. What if our universe is not the center of anything? What if it is not even the main structure? What if what we call the universe is merely the outer edge of something vastly larger, something whose interior we are not meant to see, and whose core we will never approach? Not a multiverse in the cinematic sense, not infinite bubbles colliding. Nothing dramatic, something quieter, something structural, like living on the surface of a planet and believing the sky is all there is, never suspecting the immense volume beneath your feet. Except in this case, there may be no way down. The universe gives no signposts, no gradients, no pressure change, no curvature that points inward. From our position, everything looks flat, uniform, self-contained, a perfect illusion of completeness. And illusions are strongest when they are mathematically consistent. The equations work, the predictions hold, the models converge. Nothing appears broken, which is precisely why the boundary is so dangerous to notice. Because once you do, you cannot unsee it. You begin to realize that every cosmic story we tell begins inside a fence we never mention. A fence made not of matter, but of causality. A fence that does not feel like confinement until you try to imagine stepping beyond it. And when you do, language fails. There are no coordinates, no clocks, no signals. Only the idea of more pressed against the edge of what can ever be experienced. We are standing at that edge right now. Not physically, not dramatically, but cognitively. The question that lingers softly, persistently, is not whether something exists beyond it. The question is whether we were ever meant to know. As we drift forward, we won't try to break this boundary. We won't pretend to escape it. Instead, we'll listen to it, trace its shape, feel how it presses against every theory we build and every certainty we carry. Because sometimes, The most important structure in reality is not what lies inside the universe, but the quiet rim where understanding stops. And that rim is closer than it looks. Light does not arrive all at once. It never has. When we look into space, what reaches us comes in fragments, thin, delayed messengers that have crossed distances too large for intuition to hold. Each photon arrives alone, carrying a story that began long before you were born, long before Earth learned how to breathe, sometimes before the Milky Way even took shape. The universe does not speak to us in real time. It whispers through echoes. This is easy to forget because the night sky feels immediate. The stars appear steady. The darkness between them looks calm, almost empty. There is no visible motion to warn us that everything we see is already slipping into the past. But the stillness is a trick of scale, a consequence of looking at something so large that change becomes invisible. In reality, every point of light is a memory. The star you see is not the star that exists now. It is a version preserved by distance, frozen by the finite speed of light. By the time its glow reaches your eyes, that star may have shifted, aged, collapsed, or vanished entirely. What you call now is always late. This means that observation is not a window into the present universe. It is a museum of delayed states, curated by physics itself. And the farther you look, the older the exhibit becomes. At first, this feels poetic, almost comforting, a sense that the universe allows us to look backward through time, offering a record of its own history. But the comfort dissolves when you follow the logic to its end. Because if light takes time to travel, then distance is not just space. Distance is delay, and delay has consequences. There is a limit to how far back light can come from, not because space runs out, but because time does. The universe has a finite age, and light has had only so long to move. Beyond a certain distance, there simply hasn't been enough time for any signal to reach us. This defines a boundary not drawn with lines, but with clocks. Everything inside that boundary is visible in principle. Everything outside it is not. Not now, not ever. No matter how long we wait, even if the universe lasts forever, there are regions that are already gone from our causal reach. Their light is not on the way. It never will be. This is not an engineering problem. It is not a limitation of instruments or intelligence. It is a structural feature of reality. The universe is expanding, not like an explosion, but like space itself stretching. And as it stretches, distant regions are carried away from us, not through space, but with space. The farther away something is, the faster it recedes. At great enough distances, that recession speed exceeds the speed at which light can travel back toward us. When that happens, communication ends, silently, forever. Those regions are still there. They are not erased. They are not destroyed, but they are sealed off by the geometry of space-time, like voices carried away by a river that flows faster than sound can swim upstream. And here, a subtle realization begins to settle in. The universe is not a single shared stage where everything can, in principle, interact with everything else. It is partitioned, broken into causal islands. You live on one of them. This idea does not feel dramatic at first. It sounds abstract, technical, easy to dismiss as a detail best left to cosmologists. But it quietly undermines something fundamental about how we imagine existence. Because we tend to believe that reality is unified, that all things belong to the same story, even if we don't yet know how they connect. The notion that parts of the universe are permanently cut off from each other challenges that belief at its core. There are galaxies whose light will never touch Earth, not because we are too early or too late, but because we are in the wrong place. There is nothing we can do about it. This means that the observable universe is not growing in a meaningful sense. It is aging. The horizon moves, not because we approach it, but because time advances. And even then, the expansion ensures that new regions slip away faster than we can catch them. In a strange way, the universe is shrinking from our perspective, not in size, but in relevance. The portion that can ever affect us becomes a smaller fraction of the whole with every passing moment. Most of reality is already gone from us, and most of what remains will follow. This introduces a quiet asymmetry between existence and experience. Reality does not care whether it is observed. It does not slow its expansion to remain accessible. It does not preserve pathways for curiosity or meaning. It unfolds according to its own rules, indifferent to whether any mind can keep up. We are not observers standing at the center of a cosmic theater. We are late arrivals, watching from a corner as the stage grows wider and the action drifts out of earshot. And yet, we continue to speak as if the universe is something we are steadily uncovering, as if knowledge accumulates toward completion, as if every mystery is simply waiting for enough time and effort. But what if knowledge is bounded in advance? What if the most important limits are not technological, but ontological? Light defines what can be known. Expansion defines what can be reached. Time defines what can be shared. Beyond that triad, there is no access. And this begins to feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. Because if light is the messenger of reality, and reality has chosen to send only so much of it our way, then the silence beyond the horizon is not accidental. It is enforced, not by intention, but by structure. At this point, a question starts to form, not loudly, not urgently, but with a persistent pressure. If light determines what parts of the universe are allowed to be known, and if that permission is finite, then what kind of universe designs itself this way? Not a universe optimized for exploration, not a universe eager to be mapped in full, but a universe that reveals itself selectively, fragment by fragment, always keeping most of itself beyond reach. And if that is true, then perhaps the boundary we sense is not merely spatial or temporal. Perhaps it is epistemic, a limit not just on where we can go, but on what we can ever understand. We are still drifting inside the light, but the darkness ahead is not empty. It is simply untouched by communication. And as the universe continues to expand, that darkness does not rush toward us. It recedes, quietly, patiently, as if inviting one final thought before it disappears entirely from our possible futures. If the universe can hide most of itself behind the speed of light, what else might it be hiding behind the structure of knowing itself? That question does not demand an answer yet. It only asks to be carried forward, gently, into the next stretch of silence. The horizon does not feel like a wall. If it did, we would have noticed it long ago. Walls announce themselves. They interrupt motion. They push back when you lean forward. But the boundary we are approaching in this story offers none of that resistance. It behaves like openness, like permission, like space continuing forever in the direction of your curiosity. That is what makes it so convincing. When we imagine a limit to the universe, we picture something sharp, a final edge where matter thins out and nothing remains, a cosmic cliff where space simply stops. But the real boundary does not look like an ending. It looks like distance. And distance feels harmless. You can always imagine crossing distance. You cannot imagine crossing a law. From Earth, the observable universe stretches outward in every direction with no visible sign of termination. Galaxies thin, light reddens, structures soften into haze, but nothing ever says, "Here is the last point." The universe fades instead of stopping. It dissolves into subtlety, and the mind interprets that softness as infinity. But this softness is not generosity. It is concealment. The horizon we are talking about is not static. It is not a line drawn once and left alone. It is a moving boundary, shaped by the expansion of space itself. Time passes. This horizon shifts not outward, but away, always retreating, always staying just beyond reach, no matter how much we improve our vision. This creates a strange dynamic. Every generation believes it is closer to the edge than the last. Better telescopes, deeper surveys, more precise measurements. Each advance feels like progress toward completeness. But the horizon does not reward effort. It responds only to time and expansion. And expansion is not on our side. The universe grows in such a way that the farther something is, the faster it recedes. This is not motion through space. It is space itself stretching, carrying distant regions with it. There is no friction, no deceleration, no moment when distance becomes negotiable again. At a certain point, recession becomes permanent separation. And once that happens, no signal, no light, no particle, no influence of any kind can ever bridge the gap. This is the event horizon of cosmology. But the name is misleading. It sounds like an occurrence, something dramatic, something that happens once. In reality, it is a condition that quietly defines what belongs to your universe and what does not. Because here is the part that rarely sinks in all at once. The observable universe is not the universe so far, one place. It is the universe forever, as far as you are concerned. No matter how long humanity survives, no matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how clever our theories grow, there are regions of reality that will never, under any circumstances, enter our causal past or future. They are not unknown because we haven't reached them yet. They are unknown because the structure of space-time forbids the attempt. This is where the horizon begins to feel less like a distance and more like a rule. And rules feel different. Rules imply constraint. Constraint implies selection. Selection implies that something is being filtered. Only a portion of reality is allowed to participate in our story. The rest exists without us. This idea creates a subtle cognitive dissonance. We are deeply attached to the notion that the universe is a shared space, that everything, in principle, belongs to a single connected system, that even if we cannot reach something now, it is still part of the same grand fabric. But causal disconnection fractures that fabric. There is no universal now. It's not maker, no global present moment shared by all of existence. No guarantee that events in distant regions even belong to the same temporal narrative. Time itself becomes local, and locality changes everything. Because if time and causality are bounded, then reality is not one unified stage. It is a patchwork of domains, each sealed within its own horizon, each carrying on without awareness of the others. You are not in the center of this patchwork. You are inside one cell of it, and this cell is shrinking in relative terms. As the universe expands, more regions slip beyond the horizon. Galaxies that are visible today will become unobservable tomorrow, not because they vanish, but because their light becomes too stretched, too delayed, too diluted to ever reach us again. The night sky of the far future will be darker than it is now, not emptier, just quieter. This introduces a strange temporal asymmetry. In the early universe, everything was closer together. Communication was easier. Causal contact was more widespread. But as time moves forward, isolation increases. Each region becomes more alone. The universe does not converge. It fragments. And this fragmentation is not random. It is governed by precise mathematical relationships between expansion, energy density, and the geometry of space-time. The same equations that allow us to predict the motion of galaxies also guarantee our permanent ignorance of most of what exists. There is something almost paradoxical about this. The better we understand the universe, the more clearly we can see how much of it is unreachable. Knowledge reveals its own cage. At first, this seems like a purely scientific concern, an interesting limitation, a boundary condition for cosmological models. But it begins to press against something deeper when you consider what observation really is. Observation is interaction. To observe something is to allow it to influence you, to send information, to leave an imprint, to enter your causal chain. Influence cannot occur, then observation is not merely difficult, it is impossible. This means that beyond the horizon, reality unfolds without consequence. Events happen, structures form, possibly collapse, possibly transform in ways we cannot imagine, but none of it will ever matter to us, not even indirectly. From our perspective, those regions are not part of the universe in any meaningful sense. They are ontologically real, but experientially null. And this is where a quiet unease begins to take shape. Because if most of reality is causally irrelevant to us, then the universe we inhabit is not representative of existence as a whole. It is a biased sample, a narrow slice, filtered by the conditions of light, time, and expansion. Every law we infer, every constant we measure, every pattern we identify, all of it comes from inside this slice. We have no way of knowing whether the deeper structure of reality behaves the same way beyond our horizon. We assume uniformity because it works locally, because it simplifies the mathematics, because without that assumption, cosmology becomes unmanageable. But assumptions are not confirmations. The horizon enforces a kind of epistemic solitude. We cannot compare our region to others. We cannot test whether the same rules apply elsewhere. We cannot verify whether what we see is typical or exceptional. We are trapped in a single cosmic neighborhood, trying to infer the nature of the entire universe from one address. And yet, we speak with confidence. We talk about the universe as if it were a singular object, fully defined by our equations, as if what we observe here must be true everywhere, as if the horizon were merely a technical inconvenience rather than a fundamental divide. But the horizon does not agree. It continues to retreat, silently reinforcing the separation. And the more you sit with this idea, the more it begins to resemble something familiar. Not a wall, not a distance, but a perspective limit, like standing on the surface of a sphere so large that it feels flat, unaware that curvature exists at all. Everything you can see behaves as if the surface extends infinitely. There is no local experiment that reveals the true shape. Only by accumulating evidence, by noticing subtle patterns, do you begin to suspect that your view is incomplete. The cosmic horizon functions in a similar way. It allows local consistency while hiding global structure. It preserves coherence while denying context. And this raises a question that is uncomfortable precisely because it is not dramatic. What if the observable universe is not a central region, but a boundary region? What if we are not inside something vast, but on the outer skin of something larger? In everyday language, edge implies fragility, exposure, risk. But in cosmology, the edge is invisible, safe, stable. It does not feel like a place of transition, and yet all the signs point to it being exactly that, a transition we cannot cross, a membrane between what participates in our story and what does not. And membranes are interesting structures. They separate environments. They regulate exchange. They allow some interactions while blocking others. They are not walls. They are filters. The cosmic horizon filters reality. Only certain events pass through. Only certain signals arrive. Only certain histories become accessible. Everything else remains on the far side, unfolding in silence. From our perspective, the universe looks self-contained, complete, governed by a closed set of laws. But this appearance may be an artifact of being embedded in a filtered region, like organisms that evolved underwater believing pressure is absolute, unaware that conditions change dramatically above the surface. Except in this case, there may be no way above, no ascent, no escape from the horizon. This realization does not arrive with fear. It arrives with a kind of stillness, a subtle recalibration of what existence means. The universe is no longer an open book waiting to be read cover to cover. It is a page, a single page, and we are reading it very carefully, hoping it somehow contains the story of the whole. As the horizon continues to move, as more regions slip away, the page does not tear. It does not change visibly. It simply becomes more isolated in context we can never recover. Somewhere in that isolation, a deeper question begins to form. If we are standing on a boundary rather than inside a volume, if our universe is defined by what cannot reach us rather than what surrounds us, then what does that say about our role as observers? Are we explorers? Or are we witnesses confined to a perimeter? That question does not yet need an answer, but it shifts how the darkness beyond the horizon feels. It is no longer empty, no longer distant. It is adjacent, pressing quietly against the edge of everything we can ever know. And that pressure will only become more noticeable as we continue drifting forward toward the place where observation itself begins to feel like a form of confinement. The horizon keeps moving, and we are still standing right where it wants us to be. Distance feels innocent. We grow up thinking of it as a neutral property of space, a simple measure between here and there, a number that grows when things are far apart and shrinks when they move closer, something that can always, in principle, be crossed. Distance suggests effort, not prohibition. Time, fuel, patience, these are the currencies we imagine paying to overcome it. But in the universe, distance is not neutral, it is selective. What we call distance is not merely separation, it is a mechanism, a gatekeeper that decides which events are allowed to touch each other and which are forever forbidden from meeting. And the farther you look, the clearer it becomes that distance is not an obstacle waiting to be solved, but a rule already enforced. When cosmologists describe faraway galaxies, they often use language that feels deceptively gentle. Billions of light years away, at the edge of the observable universe, receding from us. These phrases sound like temporary states, as if the galaxies are simply very far, and if we were clever enough, persistent enough, we might one day bridge the gap. But the mathematics tells a different story. Some distances are not distances at all. They are permissions that have expired. When space expands, it does not stretch evenly in a way that preserves the possibility of reunion. It stretches in a way that actively prevents it. Beyond a certain threshold, separation is no longer something you can work against. It becomes something that defines what is possible. Imagine shouting across a field. At first, the sound reaches the other side. As the field grows wider, your voice weakens, but still carries. But now imagine the field itself expanding faster than sound can travel. No matter how loudly you shout, the distance grows faster than your words can move. Eventually, the very act of speaking becomes meaningless. That is what happens with light. There are regions of space where photons are emitted faithfully, traveling exactly as physics demands, yet they will never arrive anywhere else. They are not absorbed, not scattered, not destroyed. They simply fall behind the expansion, trapped in a widening gulf that no messenger can cross. From our perspective, those regions are silent. But silence does not imply absence. This is where the idea of edge becomes misleading. We tend to imagine the boundary of the observable universe as a line we could draw on a map, a circle around us beyond which nothing exists. But that is not how it works. There is no edge in space, only an edge in interaction. Everything beyond the horizon still exists in the same way everything within it does. Matter behaves, energy flows, time passes locally. There is no cosmic marker that says, "You are now beyond relevance," and as with. Relevance is something we assign, and distance assigns it for us. This reframes the observable universe in a subtle but profound way. It is not the largest structure we can see. It is the largest structure that can ever matter to us, not emotionally, not philosophically, but causally. Nothing beyond that boundary can influence us. Nothing we do can influence it. The separation is mutual, and mutual separation carries a strange implication. If distance determines relevance, then the universe is not a single unified environment. It is a mosaic of relevance zones, each one sealed by the speed of light and the expansion of space. Each zone contains its own history, its own future, its own causal web. From inside one of these zones, everything feels coherent. Laws appear universal. Patterns repeat. Predictions work. The universe feels stable and consistent. But consistency within a zone does not guarantee consistency beyond it. This is where our confidence quietly outruns our evidence. We assume that the laws of physics apply everywhere because they apply here. We assume that constants are constant because we cannot see them vary. We assume that the universe is homogeneous and isotropic because our local measurements suggest it is. But the horizon prevents verification. We cannot check what lies beyond. We cannot sample other regions. We cannot compare conditions across causally disconnected domains. Our assumption of uniformity is pragmatic, not proven, and pragmatism has limits. If distance filters reality, then our view of the universe is not neutral. It is curated. The observable universe is the portion of existence that happens to be close enough, slow enough, and early enough to still be in conversation with us. Everything else is excluded by timing, and this exclusion is not symmetrical across time. In the distant past, the universe was smaller. Regions that are now unreachable were once causally connected. Light exchanged freely. Conditions were shared. The early universe was more unified than the one we inhabit now. As time moves forward, that unity fractures. The universe does not bring regions together. It pulls them apart. This introduces a quiet arrow of epistemic decay, not entropy in the thermodynamic sense, but a loss of shared context, a gradual erosion of what can be mutually known. From our vantage point, the universe becomes less accessible with time, not more. This is the opposite of the story we like to tell ourselves. We imagine progress as accumulation, knowledge growing, horizons expanding, mysteries shrinking. But cosmology suggests a different narrative, one where the universe slowly withdraws from our reach, leaving us with a diminishing archive of accessible reality. The archive feels vast now, almost overwhelming. Billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, scales that dwarf comprehension. But relative to the whole, this archive may be vanishingly small. And we have no way of knowing how small, because we cannot see what we are missing. Distance has already decided that, for us, this creates an uncomfortable ambiguity in the concept of everything. When we say everything exists, what do we mean? Everything that exists anywhere? Or everything that exists for us? These are not the same thing. If most of reality is permanently out of causal contact, then existence itself bifurcates into two categories: existence with interaction and existence without interaction. The former participates in our universe. The latter does not, and participation matters. Without interaction, there is no observation. Without observation, there is no evidence. Without evidence, there is no science. And without science, there is no story we can tell about what is happening there. Those regions become ontological ghosts, fully real, yet absent from all narratives. This is not a failure of curiosity. It is a consequence of structure. The universe is built in such a way that some parts are allowed to speak to us, and others are not. Distance is the mechanism by which that permission is enforced. And here, something subtle shifts. Distance stops feeling like geometry. It starts feeling like governance, not in the sense of intention or design, but in the sense of regulation. Distance regulates interaction. It decides which histories can overlap and which must remain isolated. It partitions reality into compartments that never meet. From inside a compartment, everything feels continuous. But that continuity is local. Global continuity is an assumption we cannot test. This is where the idea of being at the edge takes on a new meaning. We are not at the edge of space. We are at the edge of participation. The boundary marks the limit of involvement, not existence. Beyond it, reality continues without reference to us. This realization is strangely quiet. It does not demand panic. It does not threaten survival. It simply repositions us. It suggests that the universe is not arranged around our capacity to understand it. We are not late explorers racing to catch up. We are bounded observers, living inside a carefully defined window of relevance. And that window is closing. Expansion continues. More regions slip beyond interaction. The future universe becomes more isolated, more fragmented, more locally self-contained. Each causal island drifts further from the others, not in space, but in possibility. One day, if intelligence still exists, the night sky will hold fewer stories, fewer visible galaxies, fewer signals from deep time. The universe will feel smaller, even though it is larger than ever. Distance will have erased the context, and context matters more than scale. Without context, even vastness becomes trivial. This invites a thought that is difficult to sit with. If distance determines what can matter, then perhaps the observable universe is not the interior of something larger, but the outer layer of something whose deeper regions are inaccessible by design. Not designed by intention, designed by consequence. The laws that govern expansion, light, and causality conspire to keep us on the surface of reality, looking outward, never inward. We see across, but not through. We map edges, not cores, and cores matter. In every structure we know, atoms, planets, stars, surfaces behave differently from interiors. Surfaces are where exchange happens, where interactions occur, where energy flows in and out. Interiors are where structure is defined. If the universe has an interior beyond our reach, then we may be living on its skin, and skins are deceptive. They present a complete environment to those who live on them. They offer consistency, stability, patterns that seem universal. But they hide depth that cannot be accessed from the surface alone. This idea does not claim that there is something watching us, or waiting for us, or reacting to our presence. It claims something quieter and more unsettling, that we may be irrelevant to the deeper structure of reality, not ignored, simply unconnected. Distance ensures that irrelevance. And irrelevance is not an insult, it is a condition. The universe does not owe us access. It does not promise completeness. It does not arrange itself to satisfy curiosity. It unfolds according to rules that happen to allow a narrow band of interaction. We are inside that band, for now. As we continue drifting through this thought, the horizon begins to feel less like a limit we might overcome and more like a feature we must learn to interpret. Because if distance is not just separation, but selection, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly has been selected? Why this region? Why these conditions? Why this slice of reality and not another? The universe has allowed us to see this much, no more, no less. And the reason for that allowance, if there is one at all, has not yet revealed itself. But it presses against the edges of this story, waiting for us to notice that the horizon is not merely where vision ends, but where meaning begins to feel constrained. And that is where the next drift takes us. There is a subtle mistake we make when we talk about the universe. We assume that what we can observe is what the universe is, not consciously, not deliberately, but quietly, through habit, through repetition, through the way language shapes expectation. When scientists speak of the universe, they often mean the observable universe by default. When textbooks describe cosmic history, they describe the history of what light has managed to reach us. When we imagine the cosmos, we imagine what has already left a trace on our instruments. And slowly, without anyone saying it aloud, the boundary becomes invisible. The window becomes the world. This is understandable. We have no sensory experience of anything beyond our observational limits, no intuition for regions that will never interact with us, no mental category for realities that are permanently irrelevant to our existence. So the mind does what it always does in the face of absence. It fills the gap with continuity. We picture the universe as extending smoothly beyond what we can see, governed by the same laws, arranged in the same way, differing only in scale. More of the same, stretching outward forever. This picture is comforting. It preserves coherence. It allows us to believe that we are studying a representative sample of reality. But the horizon quietly undermines that belief, because the horizon does not merely block information, blocks confirmation. We cannot verify that the universe beyond our observational reach resembles the universe within it. We assume homogeneity because it simplifies the equations and because no alternative can be tested. But assumption is not evidence, and simplicity is not truth. This is where the concept of edge shifts again. The edge is not a place where the universe ends. It is a place where inference ends. Beyond it, reality becomes speculative by necessity, not because it is mysterious in a poetic sense, but because the tools of validation no longer apply. There is no experiment that can be performed, no observation that can be repeated, no signal that can be waited for. Beyond the horizon, the scientific method loses its grip. This does not mean that science fails. It means that science has a jurisdiction, and we are inside it. Jurisdiction implies boundary. Boundary implies exclusion. Exclusion implies that some truths if they exist, are not accessible to us, not because we are flawed, but because access itself is prohibited. This is a difficult idea to accept, especially for a species that has built its identity around discovery. We are explorers by nature, pattern seekers, boundary pushers. Our history is filled with stories of frontiers crossed and limits broken. But cosmology introduces a limit that does not yield to persistence. The horizon does not retreat because you want it to. It retreats because the universe expands. And expansion does not negotiate. This creates a strange inversion of meaning. We often imagine ignorance as a temporary state, a gap waiting to be filled by better tools or deeper understanding. But here, ignorance is permanent, structured, built into the geometry of reality itself. There are questions that cannot be answered, not because we haven't asked them correctly, but because answers cannot reach us. And this permanence changes how we should think about knowledge. If we are confined to a causally bounded region, then every generalization we make about the universe is, at best, provisional. We are extrapolating from a sample of one, a single region, a single causal island. Imagine trying to infer the structure of an entire planet by examining a single beach. You might learn a great deal about sand, waves, erosion, and tides. You might even build accurate models of how coastlines behave. But without access to the interior, you would never know what lies beneath. You might assume uniformity. You would be wrong. The observable universe may be a coastline, a boundary region where certain conditions happen to allow interaction, observation, and measurement. Beyond it, the terrain may change in ways we cannot detect, not gradually, not smoothly, but fundamentally. This is not a claim. It is a consequence of epistemic humility. We do not know what lies beyond the horizon, and we cannot know. That cannot is doing a great deal of work here. It is not a statement about current ignorance. It is a statement about ultimate limitation, about the structure of access itself. And this brings us to an uncomfortable realization. The laws of physics we observe may not be universal. They may be local. This idea is often dismissed quickly because it threatens the coherence of science. But dismissing it does not make it false. It simply makes it inconvenient. If laws are local, if they emerge from conditions specific to our region of spacetime, then the deeper structure of reality may not be governed by a single, uniform rulebook. Instead, there may be regimes, domains where different constants apply, different symmetries hold, different behaviors dominate. Not chaotic, not random, just inaccessible. And here, the horizon stops being a passive boundary. It becomes an active filter. Only regions with certain properties remain causally connected long enough to be observed. Regions that expand too quickly, behave too differently, or exist under incompatible conditions slip beyond reach early in cosmic history. What remains is a survivorship bias of reality. We are observing the parts of the universe that happen to be compatible with long-term interaction, compatible with structure, compatible with observers. This does not require intention. It requires consequence. The universe does not need to select consciously. It selects structurally. Regions that cannot maintain causal contact disappear from relevance. Regions that can remain accessible long enough to host complexity are the ones that get noticed. We are inside one of those regions, which means our perspective is not neutral. It is conditioned by expansion rates, by energy densities, by initial fluctuations, by the simple fact of being early enough and slow enough to still be here. This reframes the question of existence in a subtle way. We are not asking, what is the universe like? It's Spigu. We are asking, what must the universe be like here for us to exist at all? It's something it said, and that is a narrower question, one that may have very little to say about what exists elsewhere. This is where the idea of being at the edge acquires a psychological dimension. We are not just physically bounded, we are conceptually enclosed. Our theories are shaped by what has not yet escaped beyond the horizon. As time passes, that shaping becomes more pronounced. The future universe will be harder to understand, not because it is more complex, but because it offers less information, fewer signals, fewer shared histories, fewer connections. Knowledge does not simply accumulate, it decays. Not in what we know, but in what can still be known. This is a quiet tragedy, but also a quiet clarity. It suggests that meaning is not found by chasing totality. Totality may be forever out of reach. Meaning must be extracted locally, from what remains accessible. The universe we inhabit is not incomplete in the sense of being broken. It is incomplete in the sense of being bounded, and bounded systems behave differently from unbounded ones. They have edges, gradients, constraints that shape everything inside them. They develop internal coherence that masks their external incompleteness. From inside such a system, it is easy to mistake local consistency for global truth. The horizon encourages that mistake. It gives us just enough access to build elegant theories, but not enough to test their universality. It offers patterns without context, laws without guarantees. And yet, those laws work astonishingly well here, which raises another thought, one that feels almost too quiet to voice. What if the observable universe is not just a region we happen to occupy, but a region that defines what we are capable of being? Our biology, our cognition, our intuitions about space and time all evolved within this bounded domain. Our minds are tuned to its scales, its rhythms, its causal structure. We are not built to comprehend what lies beyond, because comprehension itself is a product of local conditions. This means that even if information from beyond the horizon were somehow delivered to us magically, impossibly, it might not make sense. It might not map onto any structure our minds can represent. The limitation may not only be external, it may be internal. We are creatures of a boundary region, trying to imagine an interior we were never meant to enter. This does not diminish us. It contextualizes us. We are not failed omniscients. We are successful locals. And locality is not a flaw. It is a fact. As this thought settles, the universe begins to feel less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a condition to be inhabited. The horizon is not daring us to cross it. It is reminding us where we are, standing at the limit of inference, looking outward through a window that shows us just enough to wonder, but not enough to conclude. The edge is doing its job. And as we drift further into this realization, another question begins to take shape. One that does not ask about what lies beyond the horizon, but about what it means that the horizon exists at all. Why should reality be structured this way? Why allow observation without access? Why reveal so much and yet withhold the rest so completely? The horizon does not answer these questions. It only keeps them alive. And that persistence, the refusal to resolve, draws us deeper toward a place where the boundary between physics and philosophy begins to thin. That is where the next quiet turn awaits. The question does not arrive suddenly. It seeps in. After you accept that observation is limited, that distance filters reality, and that inference ends at the horizon, a deeper unease begins to form. Not about what lies beyond the boundary, but about why the boundary exists at all. Because limits of this kind are not random. They arise from structure, from relationships between laws, from constraints that shape what is possible. And constraints always hint at deeper architecture. The universe could have been arranged differently. Light could have traveled infinitely fast. Space could have remained static. Expansion could have slowed, reversed, or never begun. Any one of these alternatives would have erased the horizon entirely. We would be able to see everything eventually, to map the whole, to confirm whether our local laws are truly universal. But that is not the universe we inhabit. Instead, we live in a universe where speed is capped, expansion accelerates, and causality fractures. A universe where most of what exists is not merely unknown, but structurally excluded from knowledge. This is not the simplest possible universe. It is a constrained one, and constraints demand explanation not in terms of intention, but in terms of consequence. What kind of reality produces observers that can see just enough to wonder, but not enough to verify? At first, this feels like a philosophical distraction, something interesting but secondary. Yet the more closely you look, the more this boundary seems woven into everything we know. It is not an add-on. It is not a special case. It is central. Consider how physics treats information. Information cannot travel faster than light. This is not a technological limitation. It is a fundamental rule. It shapes everything, from causality to entropy to the structure of space-time itself. Events are ordered by it. Influence is governed by it. Reality unfolds within its constraints. This means that the universe is not just made of matter and energy. It is made of accessible information. What exists for you is not what exists everywhere. It is what can, in principle, interact with you. Everything else is informationally sealed off, as if it were behind an event horizon of irrelevance. And this brings us to an unsettling symmetry. Black holes also have horizons. Inside a black hole, information may still exist, but it cannot escape. From the outside, the interior becomes unknowable, not because it ceases to exist, but because the rules of space-time forbid communication. We accept this limitation without protest. We understand that some regions of reality are hidden behind horizons, and that physics itself enforces the concealment. We do not assume that the interior of a black hole resembles the exterior. We do not expect continuity where access is broken. Yet when it comes to the cosmic horizon, we behave differently. We assume continuity. We assume that beyond the horizon, the universe continues in the same way it does here, that the laws remain unchanged, that structure persists, that nothing fundamentally different occurs. But this assumption is not justified by evidence. It is justified by comfort, because the alternative, that reality beyond our reach may be radically different, is destabilizing. It threatens the idea that our theories are approaching a final description of everything. It forces us to accept that our best models may be parochial, local truths mistaken for universal ones. The horizon invites humility. But humility is not how we usually frame progress. We prefer narratives of expansion, of knowledge pushing outward, of ignorance retreating under the pressure of discovery. But the universe does not obey narrative. It obeys structure. And the structure we observe suggests that knowledge is not expanding into infinity. It is confined. This confinement is not total. Within our causal region, understanding deepens. Precision increases. Models improve. But the scope of what can ever be known is capped. And that cap is not arbitrary. It is defined by the same parameters that allow complexity to exist at all. The speed of light, the expansion rate of space, the age of the universe. These are not minor details. They determine whether stars can form, whether galaxies can stabilize, whether chemistry has time to unfold, whether life can emerge and persist. If any of these parameters were significantly different, the universe might be fully observable but sterile, or rich with matter but too chaotic for structure, or filled with energy but too short-lived for meaning. The horizon, in this sense, may be inseparable from habitability. Just biological habitability, epistemic habitability. A universe where everything is accessible might be a universe where nothing lasts long enough to be understood, where causality blurs, where information overwhelms structure, where no stable observers can form because there is no coherence to anchor them. Our universe balances on a narrow ridge, accessible enough to build patterns, limited enough to preserve structure, open enough to inspire wonder, closed enough to prevent collapse. This balance does not imply design, but it does imply selection. Not selection by an agent, selection by consequence. Only certain kinds of universes can host observers who ask questions. Only certain parameter ranges allow for complexity, memory, and curiosity. And only within those ranges does the concept of a horizon arise in the way we experience it. This leads to a delicate shift in perspective. The horizon may not be an obstacle placed in our way. It may be the reason we are here at all. Without it, there may be no stable reference frame, no coherent history, no layered time in which cause and effect can be traced. The same constraints that deny us access to the whole may be the ones that grant us access to anything. And yet, this does not soften the unease. Because even if the horizon is necessary, it is still absolute. It still enforces a permanent division between what participates in our existence and what does not. it still guarantees that most of reality will never intersect with our story. It still places us inside a bubble of relevance, drifting through a sea of unreachable events. This bubble feels large now, enormous, but size is misleading. What matters is not how much we can see, but how much we can never see. And that remainder is vast beyond measure. The more we understand the universe, the more this remainder dominates our picture of existence, not as a blank space, but as a structured absence. A silence that is not empty, but simply not speaking to us. This silence invites interpretation. Some see it as evidence of finitude, that the universe is all there is, and that beyond our horizon lies nothing of interest. Others see it as an invitation to speculation, multiverses, hidden dimensions, deeper layers of reality. But both responses share a common flaw. They treat the silence as something to be filled. What if it is not meant to be filled? What if the silence is not a gap in our knowledge, but a feature of reality, a boundary condition that defines what it means to be an observer at all? In that case, the horizon is not taunting us with secrets. It is stabilizing us. It ensures that our universe has a center not in space, but in relevance. That there is a domain where cause and effect remain meaningful, where histories overlap, where information can accumulate without being drowned by the infinite. From within that domain, everything feels connected. Beyond it, connection dissolves. This does not mean that reality beyond the horizon is chaotic or meaningless. It means that it is not for us, not because it excludes us intentionally, but because the rules that make us possible also exclude it from interaction. This realization shifts the emotional tone of the horizon. It becomes less like a barrier to be resented and more like a condition to be acknowledged. A quiet reminder that existence is not obligated to be transparent, that meaning does not require total access, that understanding can be deep without being complete. And yet, even as this acceptance begins to form, a final tension remains. If the horizon is necessary, if it is structural, if it is inseparable from the conditions that allow observers to exist, then what does that say about the nature of reality itself? Does reality care about being known? Or is knowledge merely a local phenomenon, emerging briefly in certain regions, under certain constraints, before dissolving back into silence? The universe does not answer. It continues expanding. The horizon continues retreating, and we continue asking questions inside a shrinking domain of relevance, mistaking the stability of our local laws for universality and the coherence of our window for completeness. As this thought settles, the horizon begins to feel less like an edge we are approaching and more like a surface we are already pressed against. A surface that allows light through but nothing else. A surface that defines where observation ends and speculation begins. And somewhere beyond that surface, reality continues to unfold without reference to us. Not hidden, not forbidden, simply unreachable. The next drift will take us closer to that surface, not to cross it, but to examine how it shapes the very act of looking, and why standing at the boundary may be the most natural position an observer can occupy. That is where the quiet pressure increases. At some point, the boundary stops feeling external. It stops being something out there, at the farthest reaches of space, and begins to feel internal, woven into the act of perception itself. The horizon is no longer just a feature of the universe. It is a feature of how the universe allows itself to be known. This is where the idea of standing at the edge becomes deeply unsettling. Because edges are not just places. They are conditions. When you stand at a physical edge, a cliff, a shoreline, a city's last street, you know where you are. Your body feels the change. Gravity pulls differently. Sound behaves differently. There is feedback, a signal that tells you, beyond this point, things change. The cosmic edge offers no such signal. Everything behaves normally right up to the limit. The same laws apply. The same equations hold. Space does not curve sharply. Time does not stutter. Light does not warn you that it is approaching irrelevance. The transition from accessible to inaccessible is smooth, invisible, and absolute. And that is what makes it dangerous to intuition. Because intuition relies on gradients, on warning signs, on the feeling that something is about to end. But the horizon is a discontinuity disguised as continuity. It looks like more of the same until it is suddenly nothing at all. This is not how human understanding evolved. Our minds are tuned to environments where edges are tangible, where boundaries are marked by cliffs, walls, or changes in terrain, where limits can be tested, pushed, and sometimes crossed. The universe violates those expectations quietly, without confrontation. It allows us to look forever, but never to arrive. This subtle betrayal reshapes the role of the observer. We like to think of observation as passive, as simply looking at what is there. But in cosmology, observation is selective by necessity. To observe is to be inside a causal loop, to be reachable by information, to be part of a shared history. Anything that cannot enter that loop is not merely unseen. It is excluded from the observer's universe. This means the observer is not standing outside reality, surveying it. The observer is embedded inside a bubble of interaction, and that bubble defines everything the observer can ever call real. This realization has a strange psychological effect. It shifts the meaning of ignorance. Ignorance is no longer a lack of data waiting to be filled. It is a boundary state, a region where the concept of data no longer applies. Beyond the horizon, there are no unknown facts. There are only unreachable facts. And unreachable facts are not part of inquiry. They are part of ontology. They exist, but they do not belong to the domain of knowing. This is a difficult distinction to live with, because it undermines a core assumption of human thought that reality and knowledge are ultimately aligned. That what exists can, at least in principle, be known. That mystery is temporary. The horizon says otherwise. It says that mystery is structural. It says that some aspects of reality are permanently silent, not because they hide, but because they cannot speak to us. And here, the notion of edge shifts again. The edge is not just where observation ends. It is where meaning begins to thin. Meaning depends on relation, on cause and effect, on the ability of events to matter to one another. Beyond the horizon, relation dissolves. Events still happen, but they do not relate to us. They do not influence us. They do not respond. From our perspective, they are inert not because they lack activity, but because activity without relation has no significance. This creates a strange inversion. What lies beyond the horizon may be rich, dynamic, complex, but from our standpoint, it is equivalent to nothing at all. Not because it is nothing, but because it cannot participate. Distance without participation is invisible, and this forces a quiet redefinition of the universe. The universe is no longer everything that exists. Tensor, it is everything that participates. End quote. Participation becomes the criterion for relevance. Causality becomes the criterion for reality as experienced. And the observer becomes less like a witness to totality and more like a node inside a network with strict connectivity rules. This network has a finite radius, and that radius is shrinking. As time goes on, fewer regions remain connected. The network thins, links break, islands drift apart. The universe does not become simpler, but it becomes more fragmented. From inside one fragment, everything still appears coherent. Laws still hold. Structures still form. Life may persist. Intelligence may arise. But the global context is gone. Future observers will inherit a universe with fewer connections than we have now. Their night skies will be darker, their cosmology more constrained, their sense of totality even more illusory. They may conclude that the universe is small. They would be wrong, but they would have no way to know. This is the cruel elegance of the horizon. It ensures that every generation of observers mistakes their accessible universe for the whole, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. There is no experiential evidence to suggest otherwise. The boundary leaves no scars, no artifacts, no traces of what has slipped away. Only silence, and silence is easy to ignore, until you realize that silence is doing the work of structure. At this stage, a deeper question presses forward, one that no longer feels abstract. If observation defines reality for us, If causality defines participation, if the horizon defines the limits of both, then what exactly are we? Are we explorers discovering an objective universe? Or are we localized phenomena, arising briefly within a bounded domain of interaction? The second possibility feels diminishing at first. It sounds like reduction, like a shrinking of significance. But that reaction comes from confusing scale with meaning. Meaning does not require totality. It requires coherence. Within our causal bubble, coherence exists. Histories intersect. Causes lead to effects. Choices matter. Memory accumulates. Knowledge builds locally, even as global access decays. This is not trivial. It suggests that reality may not be structured for maximal knowability, but for local intelligibility, for pockets of understanding to arise and persist, even if the whole remains inaccessible. In this view, the horizon is not an error. It is a condition for narrative. Without boundaries, there may be no stories. Without limits, no stable reference frames. Without exclusion, no inclusion. The edge defines the inside, and the inside is where observers live. This does not answer why reality is structured this way. It does not tell us whether there is something larger beyond the boundary, or whether our universe is a surface layer of a deeper system. It simply reframes the role of the observer. We are not meant to see everything. We are meant to see enough. Enough to survive. Enough to wonder. Enough to ask questions that have no final answers. As this settles, the horizon begins to feel less like a challenge and more like a mirror. It reflects our own limits back at us. It reminds us that knowing is not the same as existing, and that existence does not require being known. The universe does not perform for observers. Observers emerge where conditions allow them, and those conditions include boundaries. As we drift further into this realization, the question shifts one last time. If the horizon defines what can be known, and if knowing is a local phenomenon, then perhaps the most important mystery is not what lies beyond the edge, but why standing at the edge feels so natural, as if this is exactly where an observer is supposed to be. There is a temptation, at this stage, to imagine the boundary as something dramatic, to picture it as a glowing membrane, a cosmic curtain, a visible seam in reality, where one kind of existence gives way to another. The mind wants an image. It wants something to point to, something that can be named, marked, crossed in thought, if not in practice. But the horizon refuses to become an object. It has no texture, no color, no sound. Not something you can look at. It is something you discover only by realizing what never arrives. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. The boundary does not announce itself through presence, but through absence, through missing signals, through the slow realization that certain questions never receive answers, not because they are wrong, but because replies are structurally impossible. The universe does not say no, it's seconded. It simply does not respond. And silence, when extended long enough, begins to feel intentional, even when it is not. We are deeply uncomfortable with unanswered questions. We are wired to seek closure, to resolve tension, to complete patterns. When a signal does not arrive, we assume delay. When delay stretches too long, we assume obstruction. We rarely consider permanent inaccessibility as a default state. Yet that is precisely what the horizon enforces. It enforces a class of questions that cannot be answered, not now, not later, not ever. Questions whose answers exist somewhere in reality, but never intersect with us. This forces a subtle shift in how curiosity itself must be understood. Curiosity usually assumes reach. It assumes that inquiry is meaningful, because answers are, at least in principle, attainable. The horizon breaks that assumption. It creates a domain where curiosity outpaces causality. You can ask, you can imagine, but you cannot receive. And this asymmetry between questioning and answering creates a peculiar cognitive pressure. The mind continues to lean forward, even when there is nothing left to lean into. That leaning becomes a posture, a stance at the edge. This is where many cosmological ideas begin to feel strangely metaphorical, even when they are grounded in mathematics. Because the horizon does not just limit information, it shapes attitude. It encourages a particular way of relating to reality, one that balances between engagement and resignation. We engage with what is reachable. We resign ourselves to what is not. But the line between the two is invisible, which means we are always slightly unsure which mode we should be in. This uncertainty bleeds into how we talk about explanation. When faced with a phenomenon we cannot observe directly, we often try to explain it indirectly through models, through extrapolation, through analogy. These tools are powerful. They allow us to extend understanding beyond immediate data, but they rely on a crucial assumption that the unseen behaves like the seen. The horizon quietly undermines that assumption because it enforces a regime where unseen does not merely mean unobserved, it means unobservable. And unobservable is a different category entirely. In such a regime, extrapolation becomes an act of faith rather than inference. We project our local laws outward because we have no alternative, not because projection is justified. The universe beyond the horizon becomes a mirror in which we see only ourselves. Our equations reflect our region. Our intuitions reflect our scale. Our metaphors reflect our constraints. And we mistake these reflections for reality itself. This is not arrogance. It is necessity. A mind confined to a boundary has no choice but to universalize its interior experience. Every culture does this. Every organism does this. Every observer does this. We treat our local environment as representative because survival depends on it. Questioning representativeness is a luxury that emerges only after stability is achieved. Cosmology is that luxury. It allows us, for the first time, to suspect that our environment may not be typical, that the conditions we experience may be rare, contingent, or even exceptional, that what we call the universe may be a thin slice of something much larger. But suspicion is not access, and here is where the edge becomes psychologically heavy, because once you suspect incompleteness, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot unknow that your view is partial. You cannot fully trust the apparent totality of what you see. Every statement about reality carries a quiet footnote. Within our horizon, he says, we rarely speak that footnote aloud, but it is always there. This transforms certainty into a local phenomenon. Truth becomes regional. Validity becomes conditional. Theories remain powerful, but their scope is subtly constrained, and yet life goes on. This is important. The horizon does not disrupt daily existence. It does not interfere with chemistry, biology, or thought. It does not weaken gravity or dim the sun. It simply sits there, doing nothing except defining the limits of ultimate explanation, which raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps reality does not care about being fully explained. Perhaps explanation is not a goal embedded in the universe, but a behavior that emerges in certain regions, under certain conditions, among certain kinds of systems. In this view, understanding is not something the universe offers. It is something observers construct, and construction does not require completeness. It requires coherence. Inside our causal bubble, coherence exists. Patterns repeat. Causes precede effects. Structures persist long enough to be studied. The universe is intelligible locally, even if it is opaque globally. This may be enough. But enough is a difficult word for minds trained to pursue totality. We want closure. We want final answers. We want to know what lies beyond the edge. The horizon denies all three, and in doing so, it forces a confrontation with a deeper question, not about the universe, but about us. Why do we want completeness so badly? Why does the idea of an unreachable remainder feel unsettling rather than neutral? Perhaps because completeness promises safety, a sense that nothing is hiding, that all variables are accounted for. That reality, once fully known, will stop surprising us. The horizon ensures that surprise is permanent, not the dramatic kind, not sudden revelations or cosmic shocks, but a quiet, enduring uncertainty that never fully resolves. This uncertainty does not paralyze us. It humbles us. And humility, in this context, is not weakness. It is alignment with structure. an acknowledgement that the universe is not organized around our desire for answers. At this point, another subtle realization begins to form. The horizon does not just limit knowledge of the universe, it limits knowledge of origins. We often speak of beginnings, the birth of the universe, the first moments of time, the initial conditions that set everything in motion. These narratives are powerful. They give us a sense of direction, a story with a starting point. But even the earliest light we can observe comes from a time already removed from the beginning. The very act of observation introduces delay. There is a veil, thin but absolute, between us and the earliest events. We reconstruct the beginning indirectly through remnants and imprints, never through direct observation. And even those remnants are filtered by the same horizon that limits everything else. The true origin, if such a thing exists, may lie forever beyond reach, not hidden in the past, hidden by structure. This means that the universe may have a depth of history we cannot access, just as it may have a depth of space we cannot enter. Past and beyond collapse into the same category, unreachable. And this convergence is telling. It suggests that the edge is not just spatial, it is temporal, it is epistemic, it is woven into the fabric of how reality reveals itself, selectively, locally, incompletely. Standing here, at this conceptual boundary, it becomes clear that the horizon is not an accident of scale. It is a feature of perspective. Every observer, no matter where they arise, will have a horizon, not necessarily the same one, not necessarily with the same shape or size, but always a limit beyond which causality fails and inference dissolves. This implies something quietly universal, not universal laws, universal limits. Wherever observers exist, they exist inside boundaries, and those boundaries shape not only what can be known, but what can be imagined. Imagination feels free, untethered, capable of reaching anywhere. But even imagination borrows its raw materials from experience, from patterns seen, from structures encountered, from metaphors grounded in the accessible. Beyond the horizon, imagination thins. It recycles what it knows. It recombines the familiar. It does not truly reach the unknown. The unknown remains structurally other, and this otherness is not hostile. It is simply indifferent. The universe beyond our reach does not conceal itself from us. It does not react to our curiosity. It does not wait to be discovered. Continues, quietly, without reference to observers who cannot touch it. This indifference is perhaps the most honest signal reality gives us. It tells us that meaning is not guaranteed by scale, that importance is not proportional to size, that being part of something larger does not require knowing the whole. We exist inside a bounded domain. Within that domain, everything that matters to us unfolds. Outside it, reality unfolds without us. Both are true. Neither invalidates the other. As this understanding deepens, the urge to breach the horizon begins to soften. The boundary becomes less of a challenge and more of a context, a frame around experience rather than a door to be forced open. We begin to ask different questions. Not what is beyond the edge. They sport hand, but what does the edge do to us? This will. It's make 7. How does living inside a horizon shape thought? How does permanent incompleteness influence meaning? How does local coherence survive global ignorance? These questions do not seek escape. They seek orientation. And orientation is what an observer needs more than access. Because access without orientation leads to noise. Orientation without access leads to depth. The universe seems to prefer the latter. As we remain here, suspended at the boundary of participation, another realization starts to take hold, one that will guide the next drift. Perhaps the edge is not where understanding fails. Perhaps it is where understanding becomes honest, where it stops pretending to be total, where it learns to live with silence. And that silence, far from empty, may be the most stable feature of reality we will ever encounter. From here, the question is no longer how far the universe extends, but how an observer learns to exist fully inside a world that is forever incomplete. Eventually, the mind stops pushing against the boundary, not because it has given up, but because it has learned something quieter, something more stable than answers. It learns that the horizon is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived with. And conditions, unlike problems, do not disappear when confronted. They shape everything that grows within them. This is where the idea of being trapped at the edge subtly transforms. At first, the word trapped feels heavy. It suggests confinement, loss, a lack of freedom. But the longer you sit with the horizon, the clearer it becomes that freedom has never meant unlimited access. Freedom has always meant meaningful movement within constraints. Even the most basic forms of life exist only because boundaries exist, membranes, gradients, limits that allow order to persist. Without boundaries, nothing holds shape. The universe is no different. If everything could influence everything else instantly, coherence would collapse, causes would blur, effects would lose direction, time itself would struggle to maintain sequence. The very idea of before and after would weaken. A universe without horizons might be fully accessible but also uninhabitable. The horizon, then, is not simply a denial. It is a stabilizer. It limits interaction so that structure can exist. It restricts information so that meaning can form. It confines relevance so that history can accumulate without dissolving into noise. From this angle, standing at the edge is not a failure of reach. It is the default position of any observer. Observers do not arise in boundless realities. They arise in pockets where limits make persistence possible, where not everything happens at once, where some things are excluded so others can matter. This reframes the role of knowledge itself. Knowledge is not a march toward totality. It is an adaptive response to constraint. It emerges where information is scarce enough to be organized, but rich enough to be patterned. Too little information, and nothing can be learned. Too much, and nothing can be distinguished. The horizon ensures the balance. It filters reality down to a bandwidth that minds can inhabit. This does not mean the universe is designed for understanding. It means understanding is designed for the universe we inhabit. Cognition evolves inside boundaries, just as bodies evolve inside environments. Our intuitions, our logic, our expectations of continuity and causality, all are shaped by the structure of our accessible world. It means the discomfort we feel at the horizon is not a sign of injustice. It is a sign of mismatch. Our minds crave completeness because they evolved in environments where completeness was achievable at local scales. You could map a forest, learn a coastline, understand a sky that repeated itself nightly. Those successes trained us to believe that understanding grows until it ends in mastery. Cosmology breaks that pattern. It introduces a scale where mastery is structurally impossible. And that forces a recalibration not of science, but of expectation. Once this recalibration begins, a subtle shift occurs in how the universe feels. It stops feeling like a riddle, withholding its solution. It starts to feel like a landscape, with regions you can inhabit and regions you cannot enter. You do not resent the ocean floor for being inaccessible without special equipment. You do not feel cheated by the sun for being impossible to touch. You accept these limits because they are consistent, because they do not pretend to be otherwise. The horizon is the same kind of limit. It does not tease. It does not flicker. It does not move closer when you try harder. It remains exactly where structure demands it be. And that reliability is important. It allows us to build stable frameworks of meaning inside the boundary, to develop sciences that work, even if they are incomplete, to tell stories that resonate, even if they are local, to live lives that matter, even if they unfold inside a tiny fraction of reality. This perspective does not diminish wonder. It refines it. Wonder no longer comes from imagining infinite access. It comes from recognizing how much structure emerges inside such strict limits, how much complexity arises without needing the whole, how deep experience can be, even when global context is missing. This is where the idea of the universe as a surface of something larger begins to lose its urgency. Whether or not there is an interior beyond our reach becomes secondary. What matters more is that surfaces are where interaction happens, where exchange occurs, where patterns form, where life appears. If we are on a surface, It is not a place of insignificance. It is a place of activity. Surfaces are where chemistry reacts, where atmospheres meet space, where oceans meet land, where energy gradients drive change. Interiors may hold mass and stability, but surfaces host complexity. If the universe has an interior we cannot access, then living on its edge may be the only place where observation is possible at all. And that reframes the emotional tone of the horizon once more. It is no longer a reminder of exclusion. It is a reminder of placement. We are where interaction is allowed, where light arrives, where histories overlap, where cause and effect still converse. Beyond the horizon, reality may be vast, but it is mute with respect to us. Here, reality speaks, quietly, indirectly, through delayed photons and stretched signals, through patterns we can decode and stories we can tell. This is not everything, but it is enough to sustain meaning. As this understanding settles, the earlier anxiety about missing something begins to soften. The fear of incompleteness gives way to a different question, not what are we missing, but what can only exist here. When the goes and exams, what kinds of structures require horizons to exist? What kinds of minds arise only in bounded worlds? What forms of meaning depend on partial access rather than total knowledge? These questions point inward rather than outward. They suggest that the most interesting consequences of the horizon are not cosmological, but existential. That the edge shapes not only what we can know, but what we can be. A being that knows everything would not wonder. A being that sees everything would not interpret. A being without boundaries would not tell stories. Stories require omission. They require selection. They require edges. The universe, by denying us totality, grants us narrative. It grants us the ability to trace causes, to infer intentions, to build frameworks that connect the visible to the meaningful. In a fully accessible reality, there may be no perspective, no foreground or background, no signal-to-noise separation. Everything would arrive at once, equally weighted, equally overwhelming. The horizon prevents that collapse. It preserves perspective. Perspective is where consciousness lives. This does not answer whether the universe is part of something larger. It does not deny the possibility. It simply loosens its grip on urgency. The need to know what lies beyond the edge becomes less desperate, less central. The edge remains, but it no longer feels like a cage. It feels like a frame, and frames are not prisons. They are what allow an image to exist at all. As we continue drifting, the question will shift again, away from structure, away from limits, away from what cannot be crossed, toward something quieter. What it feels like to live permanently inside a frame, to know that the picture is incomplete, and to find, within that incompleteness, a strange and steady form of peace. That is the direction the silence now points us toward. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the edge stops provoking fear and starts producing orientation. Not comfort, not relief. Orientation. You begin to sense where you are, not in space, but in relation to what can and cannot be known. This is subtle because the horizon does not announce itself with signs or warnings. It reveals itself only through repetition, through the consistent absence of certain answers, through the realization that some questions, no matter how carefully phrased, always dissolve into the same silence. At first, this silence feels like failure. Then it begins to feel like structure. Every stable system has limits. Cells have membranes. Languages have grammars. Minds have attention spans. Without boundaries, everything leaks into everything else, and coherence collapses. The universe appears to obey the same principle. It does not offer unlimited access, because unlimited access would erase distinction. Distinction is what allows anything to stand out. Standing at the edge, you start to notice how much of your experience depends on exclusion. You notice that meaning emerges not from total awareness, but from selective focus. You do not hear every sound at once. You hear what matters. You do not perceive all light. You see what contrasts. You do not understand everything. You understand what connects. The horizon is doing something similar at a cosmic scale. It excludes so that patterns can form. And once you see this, the idea of being confined begins to lose its sharpness. Confinement implies that something essential has been taken away. But what if nothing essential was ever promised? What if the universe never intended to be fully disclosed? Not because it is hiding, but because disclosure is not its function. The universe does not exist to be known. Knowing is something that happens inside it, locally, temporarily, under specific conditions. This is an uncomfortable inversion. It places knowledge as a byproduct, not a destination, as an emergent phenomenon, not a final achievement, and it suggests that the hunger for totality may be a misapplied instinct useful at human scales, misleading at cosmic ones. Once this inversion takes hold, the edge starts to feel less like an obstruction and more like a signal that says, this is the domain where understanding is meaningful. Beyond this, understanding would not deepen, it would dissolve. Imagine a map that included every grain of sand, every molecule of air, every fluctuation of temperature. Such a map would be perfectly complete and completely useless. It would offer no guidance, no emphasis, no structure. Meaning requires loss. It requires compression. It requires boundaries that decide what to keep and what to discard. The horizon compresses reality for us. It discards most of it. And what remains is a version of the universe that can be lived in. This does not mean the discarded parts are unimportant in an absolute sense. It means they are unimportant to us. And importance, like relevance, is always relational. It does not exist independently. It emerges between things that can affect each other. The horizon defines the set of things that can affect us, and in doing so, it defines the universe we inhabit. There is a quiet elegance in this. The same structure that denies us access to the whole also protects us from being overwhelmed by it. The same rules that enforce ignorance also allow comprehension. The same limits that frustrate curiosity also make curiosity viable. At the edge, you begin to recognize a pattern that repeats across scales. Too much input overwhelms perception. Too little input starves it. Between these extremes lies a narrow band where meaning can form. The observable universe may be that band, not the whole of existence, but the portion of existence that supports observers. This reframes the earlier question, why this region? In a gentler way. Perhaps this region is not special because it was chosen, but because it persists. It persists long enough for complexity to arise. It maintains causal coherence long enough for memory to accumulate. It remains connected long enough for questions to be asked. Most regions may not. They may expand too quickly, collapse too soon, fragment too violently, or drift into irrelevance before structure can stabilize. From our position, we would never know. Their histories would be sealed off before they could leave a trace. What remains visible, then, is not a random sample. It is a survivorship sample of reality, a selection of regions that happen to stay causally connected long enough to be noticed. This does not imply purpose. It implies filtering, and filtering changes interpretation. Once you accept that what you observe has been filtered by accessibility, stability, and duration, you stop expecting it to represent the whole. You begin to treat it as a local ecology, rich, intricate, meaningful in itself, but not authoritative about everything that exists. The universe becomes less like a book with missing pages and more like a chapter that never claimed to be the entire story. And chapters can be profound without being complete. This shift has consequences for how you relate to mystery. Mystery is no longer a flaw in knowledge. It is a boundary condition, a feature of systems where observers are embedded rather than external. The universe does not withhold answers maliciously. It simply does not route all answers to every location. You are not missing information because you failed to look hard enough. You are missing it because it does not belong here. That realization carries a strange calm. It does not eliminate curiosity, but it softens its urgency. Curiosity becomes less about conquest and more about attunement. Less about reaching beyond the edge and more about listening carefully within it. Listening for patterns, listening for echoes, listening for what repeats and what fades. This is where the edge begins to teach, rather than resist. It teaches that understanding is not a matter of accumulation, but of alignment, aligning with the scales at which structure exists, aligning with the rhythms of causality that still reach us, aligning with the fact that some silences are not invitations to speculate, but signals to stop. Stopping does not mean stagnation. It means recognizing when further motion would add noise rather than clarity. The universe is vast, but clarity is fragile, and clarity survives only where limits hold. As this settles, the sensation of standing at the edge changes again. It no longer feels like standing before an abyss. It feels like standing at the perimeter of a clearing, a place where the view is open enough to orient yourself, but bounded enough to remain legible. Beyond the clearing, the forest continues, but you do not need to enter it to understand where you are. This does not resolve the question of whether the universe is part of something larger. That question remains suspended, neither answered nor dismissed. It simply becomes less central. The more pressing realization is this: whatever the universe is beyond our reach, it does not define our existence. What defines our existence is what can touch us, what can shape us, what can be remembered. And all of that happens here, inside the frame drawn by light, time, and expansion. The edge does not ask us to cross it. It asks us to notice it. And in noticing it, to notice ourselves, how our desire for totality slowly gives way to a deeper appreciation of locality. We are not witnesses to everything. We are participants in something specific. And specificity is not a loss. It is the condition under which meaning survives. As this thought lingers, another quiet question begins to form, not about what lies beyond the horizon, but about what happens as the horizon continues to move, because it does not stay still. It recedes. It carries parts of the universe away from relevance. And that motion, slow but relentless, has consequences not just for cosmology, but for the future of understanding itself. That is where the next silence opens. Time does not move the way we imagine. We picture it as a river flowing forward, carrying everything with it. Events pass, moments disappear, the past recedes, the future approaches. It feels continuous, directional, inevitable. But at cosmic scales, time behaves less like a river and more like a sorting mechanism. It decides what remains connected and what does not. As the universe expands, it does not merely stretch space, it stretches relevance across time. Regions that were once part of a shared story slowly drift into separate narratives. They do not vanish, they simply stop mattering to each other. This is easy to misunderstand. We often talk about the universe as if it has a single timeline, a grand sequence of events unfolding everywhere at once. But this is an illusion born from proximity, from living inside a region where causal connections are still dense enough to feel global. At larger scales, time fragments. What happens now for you is not happening now everywhere else. In fact, there is no universal now. There are only local nows, stitched together loosely where light and causality allow. Beyond the horizon, those stitches tear. This means the universe is not just spatially partitioned, it is temporally partitioned. Different regions are no longer part of the same unfolding moment. They do not share a future, they do not share a destiny. They do not even share a meaningful present. From your position, entire cosmic histories are already sealed, not ended but isolated. They will continue to unfold on their own timelines, never intersecting with yours again. And that separation is permanent. This introduces a quiet but profound shift in how existence should be understood. The universe is not a single story progressing from beginning to end. It is a collection of stories that slowly lose the ability to reference one another. Early in cosmic history, everything was closer, not just spatially, but causally. Information flowed freely. Regions influenced each other. The universe behaved like a tightly woven fabric. As time passes, that fabric unravels. Threads stretch, connections thin. Eventually, they snap not violently, but cleanly. Once broken, they do not reattach. The future is not a convergence. It is a dispersal. And dispersal has consequences for meaning. Meaning depends on continuity. on shared context, on the ability for causes to echo into effects. When continuity breaks, meaning becomes local. Histories shrink to the size of their causal neighborhoods. This is not speculation. It is already happening. Galaxies that are visible today will one day be gone, not destroyed, not faded, but removed from relevance. Their light will stretch beyond detection. Their signals will thin into noise. Their histories will continue, but without witnesses. Future observers will never know they existed, not because those galaxies were insignificant, but because time separated them too completely. This is the part that feels unsettling when you sit with it. The universe is actively erasing its own context, not intentionally. Structurally, as expansion accelerates, the rate of disconnection increases. More regions slip beyond the horizon. More shared history dissolves. The accessible universe becomes a smaller archive of a much larger reality. And this archive is not preserved for us. It is preserved by accident, by timing, by the simple fact that we exist now, rather than later. This means our cosmological picture is privileged in a strange way. Not because we are special, but because we arrived early enough to still see a lot. Future civilizations, no matter how advanced, will inherit a poorer sky. They may develop flawless theories of gravity, quantum fields, and space-time, but their data will be thinner, their evidence weaker, their confidence more fragile. They may conclude that the universe is static, empty, or limited in extent. They would be wrong, but they would be correct locally. And locality is all the universe ever guarantees. This raises a subtle tension between truth and access. What is true globally may be inaccessible locally. What is accessible locally may be mistaken for global truth. The horizon ensures this mismatch persists. It guarantees that every observer mistakes their accessible universe for the whole, unless they deliberately account for what they cannot see. But even that accounting is abstract. It relies on mathematics and inference, not experience. You cannot feel the universe shrinking. You cannot sense galaxies slipping away. The night sky changes too slowly for intuition to register. The loss of connection happens on timescales that dwarf civilizations. By the time the absence is obvious, the memory of connection is gone. This is how the universe hides its own incompleteness. Not by deception, by patience. Time smooths the loss until it feels natural. And this introduces a final, unsettling idea. The horizon is not just a boundary we observe, it is a boundary that moves us. As time passes, we are carried deeper into a smaller causal region, not by motion through space, but by the evolution of space-time itself. We are not walking toward the edge. The edge is walking away from us, taking pieces of reality with it. This motion is irreversible. No future action can reclaim what has slipped beyond causal contact. No signal can be sent. No probe can chase after it. No record can be reconstructed once light fades beyond reach. The universe does not keep backups. This makes the present moment cosmologically rare, not precious in a sentimental sense, rare in a structural sense. We exist at a time when the universe is still richly connected, when signals from distant regions still arrive, when the past is still legible across vast distances, when context has not yet collapsed entirely. This does not last forever, and it raises a question that feels heavier than the earlier ones. If the horizon is closing in, not on us, but around us, then what happens to understanding as time goes on? Does knowledge plateau? Does cosmology become speculation without data? Does meaning retreat inward as the universe grows quieter? Or does understanding adapt, finding depth in smaller and smaller domains? The universe does not answer. It simply continues expanding, carrying its stories away from one another, leaving observers behind in increasingly isolated pockets of relevance. As we stand here early, connected, still able to see far, it becomes clear that the edge is not just something we face, it is something we are moving with. And the direction of that movement matters, because the next realization does not concern what lies beyond the horizon, but what happens to an observer when the horizon becomes most of what remains. There is a moment when accumulation stops helping. Up to this point, Every new idea has felt like an extension of the last. Boundaries led to horizons. Horizons led to fragmentation. Fragmentation led to locality. Each realization stacked neatly on top of the previous one, building a structure that still felt manageable, still felt like progress. But now something changes. The next realization does not add, it subtracts. It does not give you a new piece of information. It quietly removes a hidden assumption you didn't know you were carrying. And when that assumption dissolves, the entire picture shifts not outward, but inward. The assumption is simple, that we are looking out at the universe. In reality, we have always been looking from inside a condition. This is the turning point. Because once you see that observation itself is conditioned, everything you thought was external suddenly becomes reflexive. The universe is no longer just something that has limits. It is something that creates limits as part of being observed at all. This is difficult to notice because the mind prefers to place limits out there, at the far edge of space or time. It feels safer to imagine constraints as distant. But the most important constraints are not far away. They are here. They are now. They are embedded in the act of knowing. Every observation you have ever made directly or through instruments shares a common feature. It arrives to you delayed, filtered, compressed, translated into forms your nervous system can process. You never receive reality raw. You receive a version that has already passed through multiple layers of mediation. Light carries information. Detectors convert it. Models interpret it, which frames it. By the time understanding occurs, reality has been reshaped into something survivable. This is not a flaw. It is a requirement. Without mediation, there is no comprehension, only overload. The cosmic horizon is simply the largest expression of this same principle. It is mediation at the scale of space-time itself. It ensures that only a certain bandwidth of reality reaches any given observer, and that bandwidth defines the observer. This is the part that quietly rearranges everything. We tend to think of observers as independent entities who happen to live in the universe, as if consciousness could arise anywhere, under any conditions, and simply look outward at whatever exists. But that picture assumes that observation is passive. It is not. Observation is participatory. To observe is to be inside a causal loop. To receive information is to be shaped by what can reach you. To understand is to align with the structure of what remains accessible. In this sense, the universe does not merely contain observers. It produces observer-shaped regions. Regions where information flow is limited in just the right way, where signals arrive slowly enough to be ordered, where histories overlap long enough to form memory, where futures remain open long enough to allow anticipation. The horizon is not just a boundary around observers. It is part of what makes observers possible. This realization lands softly, but it does not leave quietly, because it implies that the limits we have been describing are not accidental obstacles on the path to total understanding. They are constitutive features of understanding itself. There is no version of an observer that sees everything. Such a thing would not be an observer. It would be a collapse, without horizons, without delays, without partial access. There is no perspective, no foreground, no background, no meaningful distinction between signal and noise. Everything would arrive at once, and nothing would make sense. The universe we inhabit avoids that outcome by enforcing separation, by introducing distance, by capping speed, by allowing only fragments of itself to be known from any given point. This does not make the universe kind. It makes it stable, and stability is the deeper requirement. As this sinks in, the earlier fear of missing out begins to look misplaced. The idea that we are cut off from most of reality starts to feel less like deprivation and more like calibration. We are not denied access to the whole. We are tuned to a part where understanding is possible. This tuning is not arbitrary, it is precise. Too much connection and coherence collapses. Too little and nothing accumulates. The universe appears to sit at a narrow threshold where complexity can persist without dissolving. That threshold is where observers live, and it is also where horizons exist. This reframes the story of cosmology in a subtle way. Instead of asking how much of the universe we can eventually see, the more relevant question becomes, what kind of universe allows seeing at all? The answer seems to be one with limits, a universe that withholds most of itself, a universe that reveals selectively, a universe that never allows total access. This does not mean that reality beyond the horizon is unimportant. It means that importance itself is a local concept, emerging only where interaction occurs. Beyond interaction, there is no relevance, not because nothing happens, but because nothing connects. Connection is what turns existence into experience. Without it, there is no observation, no memory, no story. The horizon enforces connection by enforcing its absence elsewhere. This is a difficult idea to hold, because it asks us to give up a comforting fantasy that understanding tends naturally toward completeness. That knowledge, if pursued long enough, will eventually close all gaps. The universe does not promise that. It promises only continuity within limits. As the horizon retreats and the accessible universe shrinks, those limits become more pronounced. Future observers will live inside tighter causal bubbles. Their skies will be emptier, their models more speculative, their certainty thinner, but their experience will still feel complete, because completeness is always judged locally. This is the quiet irony. How much of the universe slips beyond reach, the remaining region will always feel like the universe to those inside it. The horizon ensures that illusion persists. It hides loss by stretching time. You do not feel disconnection when it happens slowly enough. You adapt. This adaptation is not just physical or cultural, it is epistemic. Our standards of explanation adjust to what is available. Our sense of what counts as evidence shifts. Our intuitions recalibrate to the shrinking domain of relevance. Understanding does not disappear, it contracts. And contraction changes character. At large scales, understanding feels expansive, grand, sweeping. We speak of origins, destinies, universal laws. But as the accessible universe diminishes, understanding becomes inward-facing, focused on local structure, local history, local meaning. Neither mode is superior. They are responses to scale. The universe seems to encourage both, but not at the same time. We live at a moment when both are still possible, when we can glimpse the large-scale structure while still inhabiting a richly connected local world. This moment is temporary, and that temporariness gives it weight. It means our questions are shaped by timing, that the very act of asking, "What is the universe?" is a privilege of a particular era. Later observers may not even formulate the question in the same way. Their universe will feel smaller, quieter, more self-contained, not because it is, but because access has changed. This brings us back to the edge, but now seen differently. The edge is not something we approach. It is something that moves with time, redefining what counts as knowable. It shapes the evolution of understanding itself. It decides which kinds of questions survive and which quietly fade away. And here is the deepest shift of all. The horizon is not only a limit on knowledge, it is a limit on expectation. It teaches the universe to expect less of itself, to stop demanding total explanation, to accept that meaning can be local, provisional, and still real. This is not resignation, it is alignment. Alignment with a universe that does not culminate in final answers, but in ongoing adjustment. A universe where observers do not arrive at truth, but circle it within shrinking bounds. Standing here, at this turning point, it becomes clear that the earlier image of being stuck at the edge was incomplete. We are not stuck. We are situated in a region where understanding can exist at all. The question is no longer whether we can escape the boundary. The question is, what kind of understanding is possible because the boundary exists? That question does not lead outward. It leads deeper. And as we move into the next stretch of this journey, the focus will shift again from the structure of the universe to the structure of the observer. Because if horizons shape reality for us, then the most important horizon may not be cosmological, it may be cognitive, And that is where the next chapter quietly begins. The most decisive boundary may not be written into space-time. It may be written into us. Once you accept that horizons are not accidents but conditions, the direction of inquiry turns inward almost by itself. Not because the universe has been exhausted, but because the universe has quietly pointed to something closer, something that has been present the entire time, shaping every observation without ever appearing in the data: the observer. Until now, the horizon has appeared external, a limit imposed by light, expansion, and causality. But these limits only matter because there is something on this side of them that tries to know. Without an observer, a horizon is just geometry. With an observer, it becomes a boundary of meaning. This distinction is subtle but essential. The universe does not care where its horizons are. Observers do, because observers are the ones who experience loss of access, uncertainty, and incompleteness. They are the ones who feel the tension between what exists and what can be known. The horizon does not frustrate reality. It frustrates cognition, and cognition has its own architecture. Your mind is not a neutral receiver of information. It is an evolved system, shaped by survival pressures that had nothing to do with cosmology. It did not arise to understand the universe. It rose to navigate a narrow band of reality efficiently enough to persist. This means that long before cosmic horizons enter the picture, you are already living inside another kind of boundary, a cognitive horizon. Your senses sample only a thin slice of the physical world, a small range of wavelengths, a narrow window of sound frequencies, a limited sensitivity to pressure, temperature, and chemical composition. Outside these ranges, reality continues unregistered. This is not a flaw, it is a filter. Without it, perception would be impossible. You would be overwhelmed by signals that have no relevance to action. You would drown in data long before you could extract meaning. The brain solves this by excluding almost everything. What remains is a compressed, curated version of reality, a world scaled to your body, your metabolism, your timescales, a world that feels complete because it is internally coherent, not because it is exhaustive. This pattern repeats at every level. Attention is selective. Memory is selective. Language is selective. At no point does the mind attempt to represent totality. It constructs models that are good enough to function within constraints. Accuracy is secondary to usefulness. Completeness is unnecessary. The cosmic horizon mirrors this internal architecture. Just as your eyes filter light, space-time filters information. Just as your mind constructs meaning from partial data, cosmology constructs theories from a bounded sample. In both cases, understanding arises not from access to everything, but from stability within limits. This symmetry is unsettling. It suggests that the horizon is not merely something the universe does to us. It is something reality does everywhere observers arise. Wherever there is observation, there must be exclusion. Wherever there is understanding, there must be ignorance. Total access and comprehension are incompatible. This challenges a deeply held intuition that intelligence naturally tends toward omniscience. That with enough time and effort, any mind could, in principle, know everything that exists. The universe does not seem to support this intuition. Instead, it supports something quieter and more constrained. Situated knowing. Knowing that is always from somewhere, always partial, always shaped by conditions that cannot themselves be fully observed. This has consequences for how we think about truth. Truth, in this framework, is not a mirror of reality as a whole. It is a relation between a model and a domain of applicability. A statement can be true here and meaningless elsewhere. A law can be universal within a region and irrelevant beyond it. This does not weaken truth, it localizes it. And localization is not relativism, it is context awareness. It acknowledges that claims do not float free of the conditions that make them intelligible. The observer, then, is not a passive endpoint for information. The observer is an active boundary condition. What can be known depends on what kind of observer exists, where it exists, and how it processes information. Change the observer, and the shape of the knowable universe changes with it. This idea feels abstract, but its implications are intimate. You experience the world as continuous, stable, and meaningful because your cognition enforces those qualities. It smooths variation. It ignores noise. It imposes narrative structure on events. Without this imposition, reality would feel chaotic, fragmentary, and incomprehensible. The universe may be similar. The large-scale coherence we perceive may not be a feature of reality itself, but a feature of how reality appears to bounded observers. Patterns persist because observers persist long enough to notice them. Laws feel universal because they are inferred from regions where conditions are stable. Beyond those regions, all bets may be off. We do not know, and we cannot know, not because we are insufficiently clever, but because cleverness itself arises inside boundaries that cannot be transcended without dissolving the very system doing the knowing. This is where the idea of being stuck at the edge reveals its final transformation. The edge is not something that traps us from the outside. It is something that makes us possible from the inside. Without cognitive horizons, there is no focus. Without causal horizons, there is no history. Informational horizons, there is no understanding. Each boundary performs the same function at different scales. It limits so that structure can form. From this perspective, the desire to escape all limits to see everything, know everything, access everything, begins to look self-defeating. A mind that truly saw everything would have no perspective, no contrast, no relevance. It would not be enlightened. It would be inert. The universe seems to avoid this outcome deliberately, not through intention, but through structure. It ensures that observers always arise inside partial views, bounded contexts, incomplete pictures, and inside those pictures, meaning can exist. This does not make the unreachable parts of reality insignificant. It makes them uninhabitable by understanding. They exist without relation to us, and relation is the currency of meaning. Standing at this realization, the earlier questions about what lies beyond the cosmic edge lose some of their urgency, not because they are answered, but because their role changes. They are no longer challenges to be solved. They are reminders. Reminders that existence is not arranged around the needs of knowers, that knowing is something that happens locally, briefly, under strict conditions, that the universe does not converge toward clarity, but permits pockets of clarity to emerge and fade. We are inside one of those pockets, and that fact is not trivial. It means that asking questions, building models, and telling stories about the universe are not steps toward total comprehension. They are expressions of a particular phase in cosmic history, one where horizons are wide enough and cognition is tuned finely enough for reflection to occur. This phase will not last forever, but while it does, something rare happens. The universe becomes aware of its own limits, not globally, locally, through us. And that awareness does not demand resolution. It demands care. Care in how we speak about the universe. In quote, care in how we generalize from what we see. Care in how we interpret silence. Because silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of a boundary doing its work. As this settles, the focus begins to shift again, not outward toward unreachable regions, and not inward toward cognitive constraints alone, but sideways, toward the relationship between many observers, each trapped inside their own horizon, each constructing a version of reality that feels complete. What happens when these versions overlap? What happens when partial perspectives attempt to align? What happens when meaning must be shared across boundaries? That is where the next quiet tension waits, and it will take us deeper into the fragile architecture of understanding itself. When observers meet, their horizons overlap but never completely. This is easy to miss, because shared language creates the illusion of shared reality. We talk as if we are seeing the same world, thinking the same thoughts, occupying the same moment, and in a limited sense, we are. Our causal bubbles intersect enough to allow communication. Light reaches both of us, signals travel, words arrive. But overlap is not identity. Each observer stands at the center of a slightly different horizon, not just cosmological, but cognitive, temporal, experiential. What you can know is not exactly what another can know. What you notice is not what they notice. Even when you agree on facts, the paths by which those facts arrive are not the same. Understanding, then, is never singular. It is negotiated. This negotiation happens quietly, continuously, beneath awareness. We align stories. We synchronize clocks. We agree on reference frames. We decide implicitly which differences matter and which can be ignored. Society itself is a vast apparatus for managing partial perspectives. And it only works because horizons overlap enough. If they did not, there would be no communication, no shared meaning, no culture. Every observer would be sealed inside a private universe, unable to exchange anything of consequence. But the overlap is never total. This is the fragile condition under which knowledge becomes social. When you tell someone what you see, you are not transmitting reality itself. You are transmitting a compressed description, shaped by your own filters, assumptions, and limits. The listener reconstructs that description inside their own cognitive framework, filling gaps with their own expectations. Meaning emerges in the space between. This is true for everyday experience, and it scales upward. Scientific consensus is not the discovery of a single, objective picture of reality. It is the alignment of many partial views into a model that works across overlapping horizons. Data is shared. Methods are standardized. Instruments are calibrated. Disagreements are narrowed until what remains feels stable enough to be called knowledge. But stability does not imply completeness. It implies sufficient overlap. This matters deeply when we return to cosmology. Because cosmology is not built by one observer. It is built by a community of observers, each embedded in slightly different conditions, different locations, different times, different technologies. What we call our picture of the universe is a patchwork stitched together from these partial perspectives. The stitching holds, for now. But the horizon complicates this process in a way that is easy to underestimate. As time passes, the overlap between observers shrinks not just spatially, but historically. Future observers will not share the same data. They will not see the same galaxies. They will not inherit the same sky. Their horizon will be tighter, and that tightening changes what can be aligned. Imagine a civilization arising far in the future, when cosmic expansion has erased most distant structures from view. Their observers would still communicate, still share experiences, still build sciences, but the raw material of their alignment would be poorer. Their overlapping horizons would be narrower. They might never infer cosmic expansion. They might never suspect a richer past. Their consensus would be internally coherent and profoundly incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. This reveals a quiet vulnerability in shared knowledge. Consensus does not converge toward truth automatically. It converges toward what is mutually accessible. And accessibility changes with time. This does not make science unreliable. It makes it historical. Knowledge is not only constrained by logic and evidence, but by when and where observers exist. What can be agreed upon depends on what can be jointly seen. The horizon ensures that this joint visibility is temporary, which leads to a sobering realization. The universe is not only hiding parts of itself from individual observers, it is hiding parts of itself from collective memory. As regions slip beyond causal contact, they are not just unseen, they are forgotten, not actively erased, but never recorded, never included in shared narratives, never available for alignment. They pass out of relevance quietly, without leaving ruins. This makes our current moment unusual. We live in a time of maximal overlap. Not maximal knowledge, but maximal shared access. The skies are still crowded. Signals still arrive from deep time. The past is still legible across enormous distances. Different observers can still compare notes about structures far beyond their local environment. This shared window is closing. And when it closes, knowledge does not collapse. It localizes. Future observers will still align their perspectives. They will still build coherent models. They will still feel as if they understand the universe. But what they align around will be a smaller domain, one that lacks the context we take for granted. They may never realize what is missing. And this is where the idea of being at the edge acquires a social dimension. We are not only standing at the edge of what we can know, we are standing at the edge of what can be shared. The horizon limits not just individual understanding, but collective inheritance. It determines which parts of reality can enter common knowledge and which remain forever private to their own causal islands. This makes the act of understanding feel suddenly urgent, not in a frantic sense, but in a fragile one. What we understand now is not guaranteed to be understandable later, not because it will be disproven, but because it may become inaccessible. There are truths that can only be known during certain windows of cosmic history, when horizons are wide, when overlap is rich, when enough of the universe is still in conversation with itself. We are inside such a window. It does not grant us authority. It grants us responsibility. Responsibility not to assume completeness, not to universalize prematurely, not to mistake a historically privileged view for a final one, to recognize that what we call the universe is a snapshot taken under specific conditions, destined to fade from view. Understanding, then, is not accumulation alone. It is stewardship, to preserve models, narratives, and frameworks that future observers may never be able to reconstruct from data alone. To pass along the idea that the universe was once more connected than it will appear to be, to leave traces of a larger context that horizon-driven forgetting will erase. This is a strange role for observers to inhabit. We are not just interpreters of reality. We are archivists of a disappearing view. And archives matter only because forgetting is inevitable. The horizon guarantees forgetting, not by force, by structure. As this realization settles, the tone of the inquiry changes again. The question is no longer only about limits of knowledge or limits of perception. It becomes a question of continuity. How does meaning persist when access shrinks? How does understanding survive when evidence thins? How do observers remain oriented when the universe grows quieter? These questions do not point outward. They point toward time, toward memory, toward the fragile chain that links one generation of observers to the next, each inheriting a universe that looks simpler than the last. The horizon is not just something we face, it is something we pass through slowly, asymmetrically, leaving parts of reality behind us as we go. And what remains on this side of the passage will shape not only what can be known, but what can be remembered. That is the silence we are drifting toward now. Memory does not preserve the universe. It edits it. This is an uncomfortable truth, because we like to imagine memory as a container, a place where information is stored intact, waiting to be retrieved. But memory is not an archive in that sense. It is a process. It selects, compresses, discards. It keeps what remains useful and lets the rest dissolve without ceremony. The universe does something similar. As horizons move and access shrinks, reality is not erased. It is simply no longer carried forward into shared awareness. Events continue to happen beyond reach, but they do not enter history. They leave no imprint on records. They do not shape narratives. They are not remembered. From the perspective of observers, they might as well have never occurred. This is not a failure of memory. It is a structural constraint. History, like knowledge, is local. It exists only where events can influence one another long enough to be recorded. Beyond that zone, time still flows, but it does not accumulate meaning. It does not become part of a story. It does not join the chain of cause and consequence that memory requires. In this sense, the horizon is not just a limit on knowledge. It is a limit on history. The universe has no obligation to be remembered. It does not store its own past in a global ledger. There is no master record of everything that has ever happened. There are only traces, signals, that survive long enough to reach somewhere else. When those signals fail to arrive, history fractures. Each causal island carries its own past, sealed off from others. Those pasts do not converge. They do not synchronize. They do not merge into a single narrative. The idea of a universal history is an illusion born of overlap. As long as horizons are wide enough, enough regions share enough information to give the impression of a common story. But that impression weakens as access decays. The universe becomes a collection of isolated memories, each internally coherent, each externally invisible. And memory itself is fragile. Even within a single causal region, memory degrades. Records are lost. Languages change. Context disappears. Meanings shift. What remains is not a faithful copy of the past, but a simplified outline, a version that fits current understanding. This is not accidental. It is adaptive. Too much memory overwhelms the present. Too much detail paralyzes action. Systems that persist learn to forget selectively. They retain what helps them orient and discard what no longer connects to present conditions. Civilizations do this. Minds do this. The universe does this. As expansion pulls regions apart, the universe forgets them not actively, not deliberately, but structurally. Their signals thin, their influence fades. Their existence ceases to matter to anyone else. What remains is a curated reality, not curated by intention, curated by causality. This reframes the meaning of the past in a subtle way. The past is not everything that happened. It is everything that still matters. Everything that can still reach into the present and leave a mark. Beyond the horizon, there may be vast, intricate histories unfolding. Entire civilizations could rise and fall. Entire cosmic structures could form and collapse. But if none of that ever intersects with us, then from our perspective, it has no past. It has no history. It has no meaning. This does not diminish its existence. It contextualizes ours. We live inside a region where memory is still possible, where the past is still legible, where signals from billions of years ago still arrive and shape understanding. This is not guaranteed, it is temporary. The future universe will be more forgetful than the present one, not because intelligence declines, but because access does. Future observers may inherit a sky with no visible galaxies beyond their own. Their cosmic past will appear shallow, their sense of origin compressed. They may never infer a Big Bang. They may never suspect a denser, hotter beginning, not because it did not happen, but because its traces no longer arrive. Their memory of the universe will be shorter than ours, and their theories will reflect that. This reveals a quiet bias built into cosmology itself. We build theories based on what can be remembered, what leaves a trace, what survives transmission. The universe we reconstruct is the universe that has managed to stay in conversation with us. The rest fades into a kind of existential background noise, real, but unrecorded. History, then, is not a neutral recounting. It is an echo, and echoes diminish with distance. This brings us back to the sensation of standing at the edge, not just of space, not just of knowledge, but of remembrance. We are close enough to the past to hear its voice, but that voice is weakening. With each passing epoch, fewer echoes survive. We tend to think of forgetting as a flaw, but forgetting may be a fundamental feature of a universe that evolves. A universe that remembered everything would never change. Every past influence would weigh equally on the present. No new structure could emerge under that burden. Forgetting allows renewal. It allows adaptation. It allows meaning to remain relevant rather than suffocating. The horizon enforces forgetting at the largest possible scale. It ensures that the universe does not carry its entire history forward indefinitely. It allows local narratives to exist without being crushed by global context. This is not comforting, but it is clarifying. It suggests that meaning is not about preserving everything. It is about preserving enough to orient, enough to explain, enough to wonder. We often speak of the universe as if it were something that accumulates complexity over time. But in another sense, it sheds complexity as well. It loses connections. It discards context. It trades breadth for depth. The observable universe of the far future may be simpler than ours, not in structure, but in story. Fewer characters, fewer threads, fewer cross-references, and yet, for those who live then, it will feel complete. Because completeness is judged against memory, not against totality. This realization carries a quiet ethical weight. If we are living at a time when the universe is still richly connected, still remembering much of itself, then our interpretations matter. The stories we tell, the models we build, the frameworks we pass on, they may become the only traces of a larger reality that future observers cannot reconstruct on their own, not proof, but testimony. We are witnesses to a phase of cosmic history that will not repeat. A phase where horizons are wide, overlap is rich, and memory spans vast distances. This does not make us special. It makes us temporary. And temporariness changes responsibility. We are not tasked with knowing everything. We are tasked with knowing carefully, with resisting the urge to declare closure, leaving room for what we cannot see, with acknowledging that what we call the universe is already a reduced version of something larger. The horizon ensures that reduction continues. More will be forgotten. More will slip beyond reach. And understanding will adapt accordingly. As this settles, the sensation of loss becomes less sharp and more diffuse. It no longer feels like something being taken away. It feels like a transition, an inevitable narrowing of perspective that comes with time. What remains is a question that is no longer about beyond or before, but about endurance. What kinds of meaning survive forgetting? What kinds of understanding persist when context collapses? What kinds of truth do not require total memory? These questions do not ask to be answered immediately. They ask to be carried forward into a universe that remembers less but still thinks, into a silence that grows but does not erase experience. The edge is not only where knowledge ends, it is where memory thins. And learning to live with that thinning may be the final adaptation an observer ever makes. The next step in this drift will not look outward. It will look at what remains when so much has already been lost. When context collapses, something unexpected survives. Not information, not detail, but pattern. As memory thins and horizons retreat, the universe does not become meaningless all at once. It sheds layers, not structure. What disappears first are specifics, the names of distant galaxies, the fine-grained maps of early epochs, the intricate web of connections that once tied vast regions together. What remains are rhythms, ratios, regularities that repeat even as context fades. This is not accidental. Patterns are resilient because they do not depend on complete history. They emerge locally. They reappear under similar conditions. They do not require access to everything that came before, only enough continuity to take shape again. When future observers look at a quieter sky, they may not see the same universe we see, but they will still see patterns, motion, cycles, stability, change. They will infer laws not because they know the whole, but because what remains behaves consistently enough to be understood. This is how understanding adapts to loss. It shifts from narrative to structure, from story to form, from remembering what happened to recognizing what repeats. In a universe that forgets, pattern becomes the deepest form of memory. This reframes what it means for knowledge to endure. Knowledge does not survive because it preserves every fact. It survives because it captures relationships that remain valid even when context disappears. Newton's laws worked without knowledge of galaxies. Thermodynamics worked without knowledge of cosmology. Logic works without reference to time at all. Each of these frameworks persists because it describes constraints that arise wherever certain conditions exist. They do not require the whole universe. They require locality. As horizons tighten, locality becomes everything. The universe does not become unknowable. It becomes self-similar. Different regions, isolated from one another, may rediscover the same principles independently, not because they share information, but because they share structure. The same kinds of order arise again and again under similar constraints. This is a subtle form of continuity, not continuity of history, continuity of possibility. Even as the universe fragments into causal islands, each island remains a place where structure can emerge, where gradients drive change, where limits shape behavior, where patterns stabilize long enough to be noticed. Observers do not need the entire past to think. They need enough regularity to orient themselves. This is why meaning does not vanish when memory thins. It changes texture. It becomes less about origin stories and more about invariance. Less about where everything came from and more about how things behave here. The edge enforces this transition. It quietly discourages total narratives and rewards local coherence. As observers lose access to distant context, they turn inward, not into themselves, but into their environment. They become experts in what remains accessible. They refine understanding within shrinking domains, extracting depth rather than breadth. This is not regression. Specialization. In human history, something similar has happened many times. Civilizations lose records, forget technologies, or become isolated. And yet, understanding does not disappear. It reorganizes. Knowledge becomes more practical, more local, more tightly coupled to immediate conditions. Cosmology undergoes the same pressure at a cosmic scale. When the universe was young and tightly connected, global narratives were possible. As it ages and fragments, understanding becomes regional. Each region develops a coherent picture that works for its circumstances. No region possesses the whole, but no region is empty of meaning. This challenges a hidden assumption we have carried all along, that meaning depends on completeness. That to understand our place in the universe, we must know its full extent, its full history, its final structure. But meaning does not require that. Meaning requires sufficiency, sufficient regularity, sufficient continuity, sufficient stability. The horizon does not remove these. It preserves them by removing excess. This reframes the sense of loss that accompanied earlier chapters. What is lost beyond the horizon is not necessary for lived understanding. It is necessary for cosmic ambition, the desire to know everything, but not for orientation, coherence, or significance. The universe seems indifferent to ambition. It is generous with structure. This realization introduces a quiet reconciliation. We are not failing to grasp the universe. We are adapting to its shape. As access narrows, understanding deepens where it still can. As memory thins, pattern sharpens. As narratives shorten, form becomes clearer. The edge does not destroy meaning, it refines it. This does not mean that nothing important is lost. Context matters, history matters. The richness of a connected universe offers perspectives that a fragmented one cannot. There are insights that can only be gained when horizons are wide and overlap is deep. We are living during such a time. But the impermanence of that time does not invalidate what follows. It simply changes the mode of knowing. Future observers may not ask, "Where did the universe begin?" is abstract. They may ask, "What structures persist here?" End quote. They may not wonder about distant galaxies. They may wonder about stability, entropy, and time within their region. Their questions will be shaped by what remains visible, and those questions will be legitimate. This reveals something essential about understanding itself. Understanding is not about possession. It is about fit. It fits the scale of access. It fits the density of information. It fits the constraints imposed by structure. The horizon enforces a gradual refitting of knowledge. What once required vast context becomes unnecessary. What once seemed central becomes peripheral. What once defined the universe fades into background. And something simpler, quieter, but no less real, takes its place. Standing at the edge now feels different. It no longer feels like standing before loss. It feels like standing before transformation. A shift from knowing about the universe to knowing within it. From global stories to local truths. From cosmic totality to situated coherence. This is not the end of wonder. It is the end of a certain kind of wonder, the kind that depends on vastness alone. A new kind remains. One that finds depth in repetition. One that finds meaning in constraint. One that recognizes that even a small region of reality, fully inhabited, can be inexhaustible. As the universe grows quieter, attention sharpens. As horizons retreat, focus intensifies. And as memory thins, pattern becomes the final archive. The edge has done its work. It has taught us what survives when access fades. And in the next drift, the question will narrow even further, not to patterns in the universe, but to the smallest unit that still carries meaning when everything else has slipped away. not the galaxy, not the star, but the moment. That is where the silence is leading next. When everything else recedes, the moment remains. Not as a philosophical abstraction, not as a poetic idea, but as the smallest unit of reality that still carries weight when context collapses. Galaxies can slip beyond reach. Histories can fragment. Patterns can thin. The moment, this precise intersection of awareness and change persists as long as an observer exists. This is not because the moment is fundamental in a physical sense. It is fundamental in an experiential one. A moment is where all constraints converge. It is where horizons, cognitive limits, causal boundaries, and memory compression intersect. Everything that cannot arrive is absent. Everything that can arrive is present. The moment is the point at which the universe becomes livable. This is easy to misunderstand. We often treat moments as fleeting, insignificant slices of time, mere transitions between past and future. But that view assumes continuity at scales we cannot actually inhabit. In practice, there is no direct experience of the past or the future. There is only reconstruction and anticipation. Both are mediated. Both are indirect. The moment is different. It is immediate. And immediacy is rare in a universe governed by delay. Every signal you receive arrives late. Every photon carries an echo. Every sensation is already a memory by the time it becomes conscious. And yet, subjectively, the moment feels present. It feels now. It feels like contact. This feeling is not an illusion. It is a compression. The brain collapses streams of delayed information into a coherent present. It creates a window of simultaneity where none exists objectively. Within that window, the universe becomes navigable. Decisions become possible. Meaning takes form. The moment is where this compression happens. It is the smallest horizon. Inside it, everything that matters to action aligns. This alignment is not optional. Without it, there is no agency, no choice, no response. A being that could not assemble a moment would be frozen in noise, unable to act, unable to adapt. The universe seems to require moments for observers to exist, and moments require limits. They require that not everything arrives at once, that information is delayed enough to be ordered, that memory is imperfect enough to prevent overload, that attention is narrow enough to focus. In this sense, the moment is not a natural feature of time. It is an engineered compromise, engineered not by intention, but by constraint. As horizons narrow and access shrinks, the importance of the moment increases. When you cannot rely on vast context or deep history, you rely on what is directly available, on what still intersects with your causal bubble, on what can still be sensed, processed, and responded to. This is not a retreat from understanding. It is a condensation of it. Understanding moves inward, from narratives spanning billions of years to structures that govern immediate experience, from origins to dynamics, from where things came from to how they behave now. The universe may be vast, but action always happens locally. And locality is where moments live. This is why the loss of cosmic context does not extinguish meaning. It shifts meaning into a different register. Instead of deriving significance from placement in a grand story, observers derive significance from participation in a living process. The moment is where participation occurs. It is where the universe, filtered and delayed, becomes actionable. This reframes the fear of incompleteness. If meaning depended on total access, then the retreat of horizons would indeed be catastrophic. Every loss of context would erode significance. But meaning does not work that way. It emerges from interaction, not from overview, from responsiveness, not from totality. A moment does not need the whole universe to be meaningful. It needs coherence. And coherence survives fragmentation. As the universe ages and becomes quieter, moments do not disappear. They become more central. The fewer connections there are, the more weight each remaining connection carries. The fewer signals arrive, the more salient each one becomes. This is not impoverishment. It is concentration. There is an analogy here that appears across many systems. When resources become scarce, organisms specialize. When environments simplify, Behaviors refine. When options narrow, decisions sharpen. The universe does something similar at the level of experience. As horizons retreat, experience becomes denser. This density is not measured in information quantity, but in relevance. Each input matters more. Interaction carries greater significance because there are fewer alternatives. This is why a quiet universe does not feel empty to those who inhabit it. It feels intimate. Intimacy is not scale, it is proximity. And proximity is preserved as long as moments exist. The moment is also where uncertainty is most honest. At large scales, uncertainty feels abstract. We talk about probabilities, models, error bars. We treat not knowing as something that can be bracketed, managed, postponed. But in the moment, uncertainty is embodied. It is felt as hesitation, attention, readiness. The moment does not ask to be resolved. It asks to be navigated. This makes the moment resilient to the loss of context. You do not need to know the origin of the universe to decide what to do now. You do not need access to distant galaxies to respond to what is present. You need alignment between perception, memory, and action. That alignment is what the moment provides. It is a local solution to a global problem. The problem of how to exist in a universe that is too large to know and too dynamic to capture. The moment is where the universe becomes small enough. This is not a sentimental observation. It is structural. Every observer, no matter how advanced, no matter how widespread their access, must operate in moments. There is no perspective that bypasses immediacy. Even a hypothetical intelligence spanning galaxies would still process experience in discrete windows of relevance. Total access does not eliminate moments. It multiplies them, which suggests something important. The universe is not moving toward a state where moments are unnecessary. It is moving toward a state where moments are all that remain. As memory thins and context collapses, moments carry the entire burden of meaning. They become the primary interface between observer and reality. Everything else, history, narrative, explanation, becomes secondary. This does not trivialize science or philosophy. It grounds them. Science becomes the art of extracting stable patterns from moments. Philosophy becomes the art of interpreting what moments imply about existence. Both remain viable even as horizons shrink. What changes is ambition. The ambition to know everything fades. The ambition to understand well, here, now, takes its place. This is a quieter ambition. It does not seek completion. It seeks adequacy. Adequacy is not mediocrity. It is fit. A moment that fits its context allows action, reflection, and meaning to coexist without contradiction. It does not require justification from beyond the horizon. It does not need to be placed inside a cosmic totality to matter. It matters because it is lived. This realization alters the emotional tone of standing at the edge once more. The edge is no longer a distant boundary pressing against thought. It is present in every moment as a limit on what can be attended to, processed, and acted upon. And that limit is not oppressive. It is enabling. Without it, there would be no moment. Without the moment, there would be no observer. This brings us to a delicate reconciliation. The universe withholds most of itself, but in doing so, it offers something more precise. It offers moments where reality and awareness intersect cleanly enough to produce experience. This trade is not unfair. It is necessary. As we drift further, the story will not expand again to cosmic scales. It will not attempt to reclaim what has been lost. Instead, it will examine what happens inside moments as they accumulate, overlap, and dissolve. Because moments do not exist in isolation. They flow, they overlap, they leave traces, and from those traces, something larger emerges, not a total picture of the universe, but a sense of continuity, a sense of self, a sense of time, a sense of meaning that does not require the whole to be present. The next chapter will follow that flow. From the moment to the stream, from immediacy to continuity, from isolated presence to lived time. That is where the silence leads next. Not outward, not backward, but forward, one moment at a time. A moment does not vanish when it ends. It dissolves into continuity. This is another quiet misconception we carry, that moments are isolated points, appearing and disappearing without residue. Flicker into existence, do their work, and then vanish completely, replaced by the next. But lived experience does not behave this way. Moments bleed into one another. They overlap, echo, leave traces that shape what follows. Continuity is not the opposite of fragmentation. It is what emerges from it. In a universe where access shrinks and context thins, continuity becomes the primary way meaning persists. Not continuity as a grand narrative stretching across cosmic time, but continuity as a felt flow, a sense that what is happening now is connected to what just happened, and that both matter. This sense is not given by the universe. It is constructed. The brain stitches moments together using memory, expectation, and pattern recognition. It smooths gaps. It infers stability. It creates a thread where none exists objectively. Time, as we experience it, is not a property of space-time alone. It is a collaboration between physical processes and cognitive compression, between what arrives and what is retained. This collaboration becomes more visible as horizons retreat. When cosmic context fades, continuity no longer comes from large-scale narratives. It comes from local persistence, from repeated interactions, from familiar rhythms that survive isolation. A day still follows a night. A heartbeat still follows another. Cause still leads to effect within reach. Continuity scales down, and in doing so, it reveals its true nature. Continuity is not about knowing where everything began or where everything will end. It is about recognizing that something carries forward, even when almost everything else is gone. This is why the fear of a quiet universe often misses the point. Quiet does not mean discontinuous. Silence does not imply rupture. A universe can grow quieter and still remain deeply coherent within its remaining domains. Continuity does not require vastness. It requires persistence. Persistence of laws, persistence of relations, persistence of memory, however compressed. This persistence is what allows identity to form. Identity is not a static object. It is not something you possess. It is a pattern sustained across moments, a recognizable trajectory through time. Without continuity, there is no self, only isolated flashes of experience with no connection between them. The same is true at larger scales. Civilizations persist not because they remember everything, but because they remember enough. They maintain rituals, languages, practices that carry meaning forward even as details are lost. Their continuity survives forgetting. Observers in the far future will do the same. They will inherit fewer stars, fewer stories, fewer signals. But they will still inherit continuity, a sense of before and after, a sense of stability amid change, a sense that what they do now connects to what comes next. That is enough. This is where the idea of being at the edge becomes almost irrelevant. The edge matters for access, but continuity matters for existence. You do not need the whole universe to persist as an observer. You need only enough structure for moments to link. The universe guarantees this locally, even as it removes global context. This does not mean continuity is guaranteed forever. Nothing is. Entropy still increases. Structures still decay. Eventually, even local coherence will thin. But that eventuality lies far beyond the timescales that concern experience. For now and for a long time, continuity holds. And continuity reshapes how we should think about loss. Loss feels absolute only when you imagine totality as the reference point, when you believe that meaning depends on everything being present. But if meaning depends instead on continuity, then loss becomes something else. It becomes a narrowing, a focusing. The universe sheds excess context so that what remains can still connect. This is not consolation, it is description. The future universe will not be empty of meaning. It will be dense with it, concentrated into smaller regions, tighter loops of cause and effect. Observers will live inside these loops, constructing continuity from what remains. they will not feel deprived. They will feel oriented. This orientation comes from a simple fact. Continuity is experienced, not deduced. You do not need to know the cosmic origin of time to feel its passage. You do not need access to distant galaxies to sense duration. You do not need a grand narrative to experience flow. Flow is immediate. It arises from the alignment of moments. And moments arise wherever observers exist. This suggests something profound about the relationship between the universe and experience. The universe does not offer itself all at once. It offers itself in sequences, not sequences imposed from outside, but sequences generated by interaction. Every interaction creates a before and an after. Every response creates a difference. Every difference creates a sense of movement. Time, as lived, is not the ticking of a universal clock. It is the accumulation of change within reach. As horizons retreat, the scale of reachable change shrinks. But change itself does not disappear. It becomes more intimate, more local, more tightly coupled to immediate conditions. This intimacy alters the texture of understanding. Instead of asking, "Where does this fit in the universe?" observers ask, "How does this affect what comes next?" Instead of situating events within cosmic history, they situate them within lived continuity. This is not ignorance. It is adaptation. The universe invites this adaptation by making large-scale context optional rather than necessary. Standing at the edge, you begin to see that the earlier longing for totality was misplaced. Totality is not where experience lives. Experience lives in transitions, in shifts, in the small differences that carry forward. The stream of moments is the true medium of existence. And streams do not require oceans. They require sources and sinks. They require gradients. They require boundaries. The horizon provides those boundaries. It channels experience into streams that can be followed, inhabited, understood. Without boundaries, everything would flood. Nothing would flow. This reframes the entire arc we have followed so far, from cosmic horizons to cognitive limits, from memory thinning to pattern survival, from moments to continuity. Each step has narrowed the scale of relevance, not to diminish meaning, but to locate it more precisely. Meaning is not lost at the edge. It is redistributed, from the vast to the immediate, from the universal to the lived. This redistribution is not a failure of the universe to satisfy curiosity. It is the universe teaching curiosity where it belongs. As this realization settles, the anxiety that once accompanied the idea of being stuck at the edge dissolves into something steadier. The edge no longer feels like a barrier pressing inward. It feels like a contour shaping flow. Contours do not stop movement. They guide it. The future of understanding will not be measured by how far outward it reaches, but by how well it navigates what remains accessible, by how carefully it traces continuity through narrowing channels, by how deeply it inhabits moments that still connect. And connection, not scope, is what sustains experience. This does not answer the question of whether the universe is part of something larger. It simply renders the question less urgent. Because whether or not there is more beyond the horizon, what matters now is how continuity unfolds here, how moments link, how meaning persists across change. The next drift will not introduce new cosmic structures or deeper abstractions. It will ask something quieter. What does continuity feel like when you stop demanding more? When you stop reaching outward? When you let the stream carry you, moment by moment, without insisting on seeing its source or its end? That is where the edge becomes almost invisible. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs to be confronted. It simply does its work, and we continue, flowing within it. At a certain point, the urge to locate the beginning fades. So does the urge to anticipate the end. What remains is something quieter than curiosity and steadier than understanding. A willingness to remain inside the flow without demanding that it justify itself. This is not resignation. It is not surrender. It is a subtle recalibration of attention. The stream does not ask where it comes from. It does not ask where it is going. It moves. When observers stop insisting on total context, Continuity takes on a different texture. Ceases to feel like a line stretching between two unknown infinities. It begins to feel like depth, something you are already inside, something that surrounds rather than escapes you. This shift is difficult to describe because it is not conceptual. It is experiential. Concepts rely on boundaries, definitions, and contrasts. But the state that emerges here is not about distinguishing one thing from another. It is about inhabiting what remains when distinctions no longer demand attention. The universe, at this scale, is no longer vast. It is immediate. And immediacy changes how meaning behaves. Meaning no longer needs explanation to persist. It does not need to be anchored to origins or justified by outcomes. It exists as resonance, a sense that what is happening now fits with what has been happening and will fit with what happens next, even if the larger picture remains unknown. This resonance is fragile. It cannot survive overload. It cannot survive total access. It thrives only where limits exist. The horizon, once experienced as a barrier, now reveals its final role. It protects this resonance by keeping the universe from becoming too large to inhabit, by preventing total exposure, by ensuring that experience remains navigable rather than overwhelming. Standing here, the question, what lies beyond, loses its urgency, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer organizes attention. Attention turns instead toward alignment, how perception, memory, and anticipation remain synchronized enough for continuity to feel real. This alignment is not guaranteed. It requires constant adjustment. Moments arrive unevenly. Signals vary in clarity. Memory distorts. Expectation misfires. Continuity is never perfect. It is maintained through correction rather than certainty. This is where fragility enters. Not fragility as weakness, but as sensitivity. A fragile system responds to small changes. It adapts quickly. It remains alert. It does not assume permanence. Observers are fragile in this sense. Their continuity depends on careful calibration between what is sensed, what is remembered, and what is anticipated. The universe seems to favor this fragility. Stable enough to persist, unstable enough to remain responsive. Too much stability would freeze change. Too little would dissolve structure. The horizon participates in maintaining this balance by limiting how much of the universe presses into any given moment. Without it, experience would collapse under its own weight. This reframes the earlier fear that shrinking horizons mean shrinking significance. Significance does not scale with quantity. It scales with responsiveness. A moment that responds meaningfully to what came before and shapes what comes next carries more weight than an encyclopedia of disconnected facts. Continuity is not about how much you hold. It is about how well what you hold connects. This connection is what remains when ambition quiets. When the drive to map everything gives way to the practice of inhabiting what is already mapped. When understanding becomes less about expansion and more about refinement. Refinement does not seek new territory. It seeks clarity. Clarity, in this sense, is not certainty. It is the absence of unnecessary reach. It is knowing where attention belongs and where it does not. It is recognizing that some questions dissolve not because they are answered, but because they no longer serve orientation. This is not anti-intellectual. It is post-accumulative. Accumulation has done its work. The broad structures are known. The limits are recognized. What remains is not to gather more, but to integrate what is already within reach. The universe at this stage feels less like an object to be studied and more like a medium to be moved through, like water rather than terrain, like atmosphere rather than landscape. You do not ask where the air begins. You breathe. And breathing does not require a map of the sky. This is perhaps the quietest transformation of all. The universe ceases to feel external, not because it has been internalized conceptually, but because the distinction itself stops being useful. Observer and environment remain distinct, but no longer opposed. The boundary between them is functional, not adversarial. The horizon enforces this boundary gently. Events collapse, without demanding confrontation. It allows experience to remain experience. As continuity settles into this new mode, time itself feels different. Less like something passing you by, more like something carrying you along. You are not racing against it. You are not chasing it. You are within it. And withinness does not demand control. It demands attunement. This attunement is what remains when the universe grows quiet, when distant signals fade, when large narratives thin. What remains is not emptiness, but a steady pulse of change that is close enough to respond to. This pulse does not need interpretation to be meaningful. It needs presence. Presence is not mystical here. It is structural. It is what happens when attention aligns with scale, when awareness matches what can actually arrive, when expectation adjusts to what can actually be known. The horizon trains presence. By denying totality, it keeps awareness grounded. By limiting access, it prevents distraction. By shrinking context, it sharpens focus. None of this feels dramatic. It feels ordinary. And that ordinariness is the point. The universe does not culminate in revelation. It settles into habitability, a state where existence continues without demanding explanation, where continuity flows without requiring justification, where meaning arises not from knowing everything, but from being responsive to what remains. Standing here, the earlier metaphors of edges, surfaces, and boundaries lose their sharpness. The edge has been internalized not as a concept, but as a rhythm of arrival and departure, of remembering and forgetting, of connection and silence. The universe breathes through this rhythm, and observers, briefly, breathe with it. The final chapters will not introduce new ideas. They will not widen the frame again. They will do something much quieter. They will allow this rhythm to settle, to slow, to fade. Because the end of this journey is not an answer. It is a state. One where the universe does not need to be larger. One where understanding does not need to be complete. One where the edge no longer feels like a limit, but like the shape of stillness itself. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the absence of demand. When the urge to reach outward quiets, when the need to situate every moment inside a larger explanation dissolves, something unexpected appears. Not an answer, not a revelation, but a kind of spaciousness inside limitation itself. The universe does not stop moving. Expansion continues. Horizons retreat. Stars age. Time flows. But the pressure to keep up with all of it fades. This is the difference between knowing that time passes and feeling chased by it, between understanding that the universe is vast and feeling small inside it. Stillness arises not when motion ceases, but when motion no longer threatens coherence. Earlier, the edge felt like a warning. Then it felt like a frame. Now it feels like a pause that was always there. A pause built into the structure of experience. Every moment contains this pause, a brief suspension where perception, memory, and expectation align just enough for experience to register as whole. It is fleeting, but it repeats, and repetition is enough to create stability. This is why stillness survives even in a universe that never stops changing. Stillness is not cosmic. It is local. It appears wherever change is slow enough to be noticed and fast enough to remain relevant. It appears wherever horizons limit how much presses into awareness at once. It appears wherever the stream narrows into something navigable. The universe, by fragmenting itself, creates countless such navigable regions, and inside them, stillness becomes possible. This reframes silence one final time. Silence is not emptiness. It is reduced interference. It is what remains when distant signals no longer compete for attention, when vast context no longer overwhelms the present, when awareness is no longer stretched thin across unreachable scales. As the universe grows quieter, silence deepens, not as loss, as relief. Relief from excess context. Relief from the obligation to know what cannot be reached. Relief from the illusion that meaning depends on total access. This relief is subtle. It does not announce itself. It feels almost like familiarity, as if something long present but unnoticed has finally been allowed to surface. Observers have always lived inside silence. They simply had too much noise to hear it. Noise is not only sound, it is information without relevance. It is context without connection. It is detail without consequence. The early universe, rich with overlapping signals, is noisy in this sense. So is a fully connected universe. Silence emerges as horizons retreat, and silence makes room for attention to settle, room for continuity to feel natural rather than forced, room for experience to unfold without constant reference to what lies beyond. This is why the universe does not feel colder or emptier as it ages, at least not from within. It feels calmer, less insistent, more forgiving of incompleteness. Stillness allows the observer to stop interpreting and simply remain responsive, to exist inside the flow without mapping it, to inhabit continuity without narrating it. This does not mean thought disappears. It means thought loses its urgency, questions soften, explanations loosen. The need to resolve dissolves into a willingness to accompany. The universe does not demand comprehension. It allows companionship. Companionship is not about equality or control. It is about sharing duration, being present alongside change without attempting to dominate it. Observers do not master the universe. They keep pace with a small part of it, and that is enough. This is perhaps the final inversion. The goal was never to reach the edge. The edge was never meant to be crossed. The edge exists so that something like stillness can appear on this side of it. Without boundaries, there is no quiet. Without quiet, there is no inhabitable present. Without an inhabitable present, there is no experience. The universe seems to have traded completeness for inhabitation, and that trade defines everything that follows. As this settles, the idea of missing out loses its meaning. There is nothing essential being withheld. What is withheld is excess context, excess reach, excess demand. What remains is enough to live inside, enough to feel continuity, enough to notice change, enough to rest attention without collapsing into ignorance. This rest is not passive, it is dynamic equilibrium, a balance between what arrives and what can be held. The horizon enforces this balance at the largest possible scale. It ensures that experience never has to carry more than it can integrate. Standing here now, the universe does not feel distant. It feels close, not spatially, but proportionally. Its scale matches the scale of attention, and that matching creates ease. This is where the journey begins to slow, not because there is nothing left to say, but because saying more would disrupt the stillness that has emerged. The remaining chapters are not about adding insight. They are about letting insight fade into background, like a sound that recedes not because it is silenced, but because it no longer needs to be foregrounded. The universe continues, observers continue, moments continue, but the urgency has passed. What remains is presence shaped by limits, and limits that no longer feel like walls. They feel like the contours of rest. The next movement will be the quietest yet, not a turn, not a realization, but a gentle release, where the universe does not need to be understood because it is already being lived. Release does not arrive as an event. There is no signal, no threshold crossed, no moment you can point to and say, "This is where it happened." Release arrives the way night arrives, gradually, without asking permission, without demanding recognition. One moment you are still trying to see, to frame, to understand, and then, quietly, you are not. Nothing has been taken away. Nothing has been solved. Something has simply loosened. For a long time, attention leaned outward. It followed the universe as it expanded, traced its limits, measured its distances, worried over what could not be reached. Even when the question softened, the posture remained an orientation toward more, toward beyond, toward elsewhere. Now that posture relaxes, not because the universe has changed, because the observer has. The edge is still there, horizons still retreat, silence still grows. None of this presses inward anymore. It no longer demands response. The universe is allowed to do what it does without being constantly interpreted. This is what release feels like. Not disengagement, permission. Permission for reality to unfold without being translated into meaning at every step. Permission for experience to exist without being immediately converted into explanation. Permission for not knowing to be stable. This is difficult to accept because so much of identity has been built around seeking, around extending reach, around closing gaps, around believing that understanding is something that must always advance, always expand, always conquer the next boundary. Release does not negate that history. It completes it. Seeking was necessary to recognize limits. Limits were necessary to reveal structure. Structure was necessary to make stillness possible. Stillness was necessary to allow release. Nothing here is accidental. The universe did not frustrate curiosity. It educated it. At first, curiosity mistook vastness for invitation. It believed that if something existed, it must be reachable. If a question could be asked, it must have an answer waiting somewhere. The horizon corrected that assumption not abruptly, but patiently. Over time, curiosity learned restraint. It learned that some questions persist without resolution, that some silence is not provisional, that some absence is structural. And rather than collapsing under that realization, curiosity transformed. It became gentler, less acquisitive, more attentive. This attentiveness does not seek to possess reality. It seeks to accompany it. Release is the moment when accompaniment replaces pursuit. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere else. You are no longer oriented toward an imagined completion. You are present with what continues to happen, without insisting that it lead anywhere in particular. This does not mean purpose disappears. It means purpose changes scale. Purpose no longer stretches across the universe. It inhabits continuity. It lives in responsiveness rather than reach. It concerns itself with how moments connect, not where they ultimately terminate. In this state, the universe does not feel unfinished. It feels ongoing without a mandate to conclude. Earlier, incompleteness felt like a problem to be solved, a sign that something essential was missing. Now, incompleteness feels like space room for experience to breathe without collapsing into closure. The mind stops trying to fill that space. And in doing so, it discovers that the space was never empty. It was holding everything that mattered. What changes most noticeably is the relationship to time. Time no longer feels like something that must be used wisely in the face of cosmic loss. It no longer feels scarce because the universe is growing inaccessible. It simply feels available moment after moment, unfolding, without urgency. This does not make time infinite. It makes it sufficient. Sufficiency is different from abundance. Abundance invites consumption. Sufficiency invites presence. The horizon, by limiting how much can arrive, ensures sufficiency. It prevents the flood that would make presence impossible. It keeps experience at a scale where it can be inhabited rather than managed. Release is the acceptance of that scale. Not resignation to smallness, but alignment with proportion. You begin to notice how often effort was spent trying to exceed proportion, to think at scales too large to live inside, to demand explanations that no experience could support, to hold the universe accountable to expectations it never agreed to meet. Those efforts fade. What remains is a kind of quiet competence. You know what can be known. You know what cannot. And you stop treating that distinction as a challenge. This has a surprising emotional effect. Fear recedes. Not fear of death or loss or change, those remain part of experience, but fear of insufficiency dissolves. The sense that something essential is being withheld vanishes. The universe is no longer seen as incomplete with respect to you. It is simply itself. And you are simply here. This mutual acceptance is not romantic. It is stable. The universe does not offer consolation. It offers continuity. And continuity is enough. This does not eliminate mystery. Mystery remains everywhere. Why laws have the form they do, why existence exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing. But mystery no longer destabilizes orientation. It no longer creates a sense of falling short. Mystery becomes background, like the sky at night, present, immense, but not something you are required to resolve before living your life. Release allows mystery to exist without demanding interpretation. Earlier, silence felt heavy because it was interpreted as absence of answer. Now silence feels light because it is recognized as absence of demand. Nothing is being asked of you by the parts of the universe you cannot reach. They do not expect understanding. They do not require acknowledgement. They continue. And so do you. This is where the metaphor of being at the edge dissolves completely. Edges imply opposition inside versus outside, known versus unknown, here versus there. But release erases the need for such contrasts. The edge is no longer a boundary you are pressed against. It is simply where interaction ends. And interaction ending is not failure. It is completion of function. Just as your eyes do not feel frustrated by infrared light, just as your ears do not resent ultrasonic silence, your understanding no longer resents what cannot arrive. Those frequencies were never meant to be heard. Those regions were never meant to be known. That is not loss. That is specificity. Specificity is what allows life to exist at all. Release brings this realization into lived alignment, not as an idea, but as a settled posture. The posture of no longer leaning outward. The posture of standing where you are, without apology. From here, the universe feels strangely intimate, not because it is small, but because it is proportioned. What reaches you fully. What does not reach you no longer distracts. Attention becomes precise. Care becomes possible. Meaning condenses. This is where the earlier fear that shrinking horizons would lead to shrinking significance reveals its error. Significance was never tied to horizon size. It was tied to coherence, to responsiveness, to the ability to inhabit moments without being overwhelmed. Release maximizes that ability. You do not need to see the whole to act meaningfully within a part. You do not need to remember everything to maintain continuity. You do not need to know what lies beyond to live well here. These truths were always present. Release allows them to be felt rather than argued. The universe does not ask you to understand it. It allows you to exist within it. And existence, when no longer burdened by demand, becomes lighter, not trivial. Light. This lightness is not excitement. It is ease. Ease with uncertainty. Ease with incompleteness. Ease with silence. Silence no longer signals deprivation. It signals rest. The rest that comes when attention no longer strains against structure. The rest that comes when ambition gives way to attunement. The rest that comes when the universe is allowed to be larger than understanding without threatening it. This is the final preparation, not for an answer, for an ending that does not close. One last chapter remains. It will not introduce anything new. It will not resolve the question of what lies beyond. It will not reclaim what has slipped away. It will do something much simpler. It will let the universe continue, and it will let you continue with it. Without demand, without reach, without resistance, just as the universe does, just as it always has. There is nothing left to resolve, not because every question has been answered, but because the need for answers has loosened its grip. The universe continues exactly as it did before, expanding, thinning, carrying regions beyond reach. Light still travels. Time still unfolds. Horizons still drift outward, quietly deciding what will never arrive. But something in the way this is held has changed. The universe no longer feels like a statement awaiting interpretation. It feels like a condition you are already inside. Earlier, the edge felt like a line separating what mattered from what did not. Then it became a frame, a filter, a necessity. Now, it barely registers at all, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer organizes attention. Edge does not need to be faced when you are no longer trying to cross it. It simply does its work, and you do yours. This is not an ending in the usual sense. Endings imply closure, a final accounting, a sense that something has been completed, but nothing here completes. The universe does not conclude. Understanding does not culminate. Experience does not settle into a final shape. Everything continues, quietly, without needing to justify itself. What remains is not knowledge, not certainty, not mastery. but a kind of alignment. Alignment with scale, with proportion, with the fact that existence unfolds within limits, and that those limits are not obstacles to be overcome, but contours to be inhabited. You are not standing at the edge anymore. You are standing where standing happens, inside a moment that does not need to be placed inside anything larger to matter. The universe beyond your reach does not press inward. It does not wait for recognition. It does not care whether it is named, mapped, or understood. It unfolds in parallel, indifferent, and complete in its own isolation. And here, within reach, experience unfolds as well. These two truths do not conflict. They coexist. This coexistence is the final quiet. Not a silence imposed by lack, but a silence that arrives when nothing more is being demanded. When curiosity rests without being extinguished. When wonder remains without needing direction. When awareness is no longer stretched thin across unreachable scales. You are not missing anything essential. What is essential is already present. The moment, the flow, the continuity that does not require explanation. The universe does not promise more than this. It never did. It offers a place where something can happen for a while, within bounds that keep it intelligible. It offers time enough for patterns to form, for memory to accumulate, for meaning to arise and dissolve and arise again. And then it lets those patterns fade, not as punishment, as process. There is no final perspective waiting beyond the horizon, no privileged vantage point from which everything makes sense at once. There are only local perspectives, briefly coherent, briefly aware, briefly alive. That is not a flaw. It is the shape of participation. Participation does not require total access. It requires presence. And presence does not need completion. It needs allowance. Allowance for not knowing. Allowance for silence. Allowance for the universe to be larger than the stories told about it. As this settles, the last urge to frame, to summarize, to extract a lesson fades away. There is nothing left to extract, no principle to underline, no conclusion to defend, only continuation. The universe continues without watching itself. You continue without needing to understand why. And somewhere beyond reach, reality continues without reference to either. This is not separation. It is coexistence without contact, a vastness that does not intrude, a presence that does not insist, a silence that does not erase, just ongoingness. Close your eyes now, not because the universe is finished, but because it never needed to be completed. It is still turning, and so are you, quietly, inside the edge